Okay, and we are live on YouTube. Is Benjamin Baker on the phone?
I'm here now. My
Okay.
apologies. Thank you.
No, just wanted to make sure before we got started. So there might be a few more people joining in here and there, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Maryland Public Service Commission's Public Conference 44 Energy Storage Working Group. This is our February meeting. On the 12th of February, I circulated what staff had sent me, staff's follow-up from the last meeting. And then on the 16th, I circulated what I had received from the utilities, the joint excellent comments on storage spreadsheet. So hopefully everyone has received those and has reviewed those. I think the plan for this meeting is to go through the both of those, mostly the excellent comments to the, and then to the extent that the utilities have any questions with regard to what staff submitted, they can certainly ask those as well. So as far as that spreadsheet and what the utilities sent around, the first item is air emissions, and the joint utilities refer back to their February 1 compliance filing, which contains revisions to what the working group previously recommended back in December of 2019. And also says that on page 9 of that as PJM provides more granular data, to the extent possible, the available emissions rates will use the data for providing emissions estimates. I had a question, I guess, for the utilities. When that more granular data, if and when that's received from PJM, is the plan to, I guess, report that in any way, or would utilities just start using that data? I don't know if that's Steve, if that's you.
Yeah, I think that's Ed Tracy on our side. Ed, do you want to comment on that thought?
Yeah, Your Honor, yes. Yeah, so I think what we would do is, I think our initial thoughts would calculate the emissions annually, and that whatever data, the latest data set would be used when we did those calculations. Typically right now, I think PJM's been updating them annually, like in April. So I think our goal was to, whenever we produce a data set, right now I think we're thinking annually, we would use the latest that's available.
Okay. Your project doesn't go into service until February of 2022, is that right? Or to be in service by then?
Yeah, that's the scheduled start date, right?
And so the tracking doesn't start obviously until it goes into service.
I wouldn't think so, right?
So the thought, yeah. I guess this is back to Ed. The thought is then, the hope is there'd be more granular data from PJM much prior to when you start tracking.
That's correct. Yeah. So we still, right now, we still anticipate each year at a minimum that PJM is going to update their emission rates. And so for 2022 in April, then that year, we would get the latest. And then, for the year 2022, we use that data that we got in April, unless something else came out, that would be updated.
Okay. But you also had another footnote that you were considering using other data as well as an alternative to the PJM monthly emissions data set?
That's correct. I mean, we have looked at, there are some other folks out there that are providing data sets. So we're just looking at those now. I guess other parts of the country have been doing some work, and so there's a nonprofit called Wild Time looking at doing data. So we've been talking to them. And then we even looked at, potentially calculating our own data from PJM data. But again, that's probably a little bit harder to do. So again, I think we'll evaluate the data sets, see what's available. And our expectation is as time goes on, those data sets will get better, because I think other people are asking PJM also for that data. So we're hoping that PJM will, provide a little bit more granular data than the monthly data they have out now.
Okay. And I guess then the question for the working group becomes, based on the revisions that the joint utilities made in their February 1 compliance filing, I think what the working group recommended previously in December of 2019 is really no longer, we need to revise that. And the question for the working group is whether we are going to recommend to the commission that the revisions be in line with what the utilities filed in their compliance filing, or another metric. And I guess I'm looking to OPC. I know Mr. Latundra's on the call. If you want to address that.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate the opportunity. So just to confirm, the new methodology that was used to project emissions for the projects, the storage projects, use monthly marginal emission rates, and you found, I think, across the projects, there was largely an increase in emissions, except for those 2 projects that were tied to renewable energy generation. That's correct?
Correct, yeah.
And so, so now we're discussing the methodology that would be used going forward for monitoring the project's performance over time. And it sounds like it's likely that there'll be new data sources that are more granular that we would then want to use going forward to evaluate the emissions impacts from these projects once they're placed in service.
Correct. The one thing that'll change, I think will be better, is that right now we don't know when the unit's going to run. So we're estimating, a certain amount of hours, let's say, of like frequency regulation. In the future, we'll know when the units, how much we charge, how much we discharge, and then we can use the more granular rates for the month of, let's just say, May. We can use specifically that May data. So again, I think with the actual data, we can get, a little bit better estimates.
I would say that the OPC would be in favor of using the most granular data that's available. And so if there's the opportunity to acquire hourly marginal emission rates, we think that would be a benefit to more accurately measuring the emissions impacts of these projects.
Steve, this is Ben with staff. I know correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in your filing with the commission, you had done an hourly analysis on the utilities energy storage systems, if I recall correctly. Is there a reason that's not transferable here? Is that just because that was an estimating model and so now we're dealing with actuals, so that's not a useful tool?
Yeah, let me go ahead and let Ed comment since he ran the analysis in the latest version. Yeah.
Yeah, so right, so exactly. So I mean, you can use, when you project, when we're doing the projections, you don't know when the unit's going to run, so it's a little bit harder to assign the data, what specific data. You can make estimates, but when we actually do the monitoring when the units are in service, again, then we can be, whatever granular data is out there. Hopefully at some point, we talk to PSC, there may be hourly data at some point, but again, we'll use the most granular data because we'll have granular, usage data, so we can match those up. But right now, that's not possible.
When you say it's not possible because you don't know the hourly emissions rate in PJM, that's what you mean?
Well, right, you don't know that,
yeah.
But you also are making an estimate of when the unit's going to actually run. And again, you don't.
Right.
That's the tricky part.
Got it. I guess I was asking from a tracking perspective in the future, not, I guess, updating the estimates now, but I guess we have to think about both. That's fair. Okay. I did have a question for the utilities. In your filing with the commission, it seems that you are anticipating tracking emissions for regulation D, but in your original filings, the argument was that basically every hour the unit would charge and discharge back to a neutral state, so therefore there wouldn't really be much emissions. And now I know that's an assumption, so I guess what changed such that you, with monthly data and not hourly data, are now able to track emissions for regulation D, charge and discharge?
So for going forward, we'll know the mode of operation. So I think what happens is if you are doing peak shaving, what we want to do is take credit for that marginal unit, that the marginal on-peak or off-peak unit. So when we're doing peak shaping, we'll know that we can take credit for that. If we're doing frequency regulation, the unit's discharging and charging kind of constantly from the signal from PJM. So again, there, you're not necessarily displacing a unit, a marginal unit. So we're just going to use the system average, if that makes sense. We're just, we'll just use that data.
So one step back though from the system average, I understand your point about peak shaving. But I guess what I was getting to, and maybe Justin, I think maybe this is a discussion I had with Justin back in the day from BG&E, but there was comments and filings made with the commission that basically stated that frequency regulation D, we could not, there would be, basically it would be net neutral in terms of emissions output from it. And so, but now we're actually tracking emissions from frequency regulation D such that it's not, it's above zero now. And so I guess I'm trying to understand what changed. How are we tracking that?
So I think the only change was that, when we went back and looked at the assumptions, we went back and so we really updated our assumptions, basically saying that, we know with frequency regulation, we're going to be, charging and discharging, and then there's a penalty, the round trip efficiency associated with that. So, we knew that was, and I think Synapse also pointed this out in their submittal to the commission. So we went back and just basically made the assumption, let's go back and capture that inefficiency for frequency regulation, because it really truly, it does impact the emissions.
That's right.
Got it. Okay. So that's all tied to the round trip efficiency losses then.
It's as long as we weren't charging by solar, or I think we did basically said we're having that. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're ready to move on to health benefits. No?
Judge, can you just give me 1 second? I'm just checking my
Sure.
thing really quick. I think we can move on if I come back to it. I might have 1 or 2 more questions, but I need to find it.
We can come back if we need to.
Could I don't know if others would see this need, but it would be helpful to have the assumptions and methodologies in one place. Right now, the February filing is good, but it has 10 updates. And if the work group is going to recommend methodologies to the commission to adopt, I don't know if it's possible for the joint utilities to take their earlier methodologies and update them with the 10 additional assumptions and updates, so that we have something that we could recommend that would be clear to the commission. It's just a suggestion for others to reject or think about, and I guess in the first place for the joint utilities to say it would be difficult or not.
Yeah, so is that something that can come from what we submitted on February 1st? Is that what you're thinking? Because there's language that describes all of that there, right?
Yeah, exactly. What I'm thinking, Steve, is that updates, you referenced your earlier methodologies. So the two need to be put together for something for reference for the commission.
Yeah, the only thing there is the description is a little bit larger than fitting in an Excel spreadsheet, right? So are you thinking of a Word document that basically is excerpted from what we submitted on February 1?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Steve, similar to what we did, back in December of 2019, we had a narrative, and where it's too big to fit in a box, it's not a nice metric that fits in the box, we'll refer to the narrative.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can probably work that up. You'll just want to review that document, right? To make sure it tracks.
Yeah, we're happy to work on it with you.
Yep. Okay.
So for health benefits, the comment that was received, I think from staff, was with regard to the fact that the tool, the EPA health benefits calculator, was, I guess, out of date. And there was hopes that was going to be updated. At this point, I think perhaps what the working group should consider recommending is to use the EPA health benefits calculator once it is finalized for storage, if that becomes available. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, David, you did the original work at looking at that health benefits calculator, right, for our initial set of filings for the working group. And so our suggestion was that everyone should take another look at the status of that health benefits calculator and come up with kind of a collective recommendation about how to use that as it relates to storage.
Yeah, I did it with Jessica Shipley, who's on the line with me from Regulatory Assistance Project. Our earlier look was an effort to take the approved model that's out from EPA, which is for health benefit calculations for energy efficiency, and apply it to storage. We worked with EPA, but they're obviously not in a position till they release what they're doing to ratify what we did. And our thinking, I mean, we don't know what EPA's current timeframe is. A year or so ago, we thought we'd have the EPA model by now, frankly. So that's why we're recommending we adopt the EPA one. We could go back and modify what we did. It would be a complex task. You know, I think we can do it with the utilities and others if they're interested in it. It's also I should know, even if we get better hourly figures from PJM shortly, the public health model is largely driven by particulates, and I don't believe PJM is looking at releasing more granular data for particulates, so that wouldn't help us here. So our thinking is simply to wait. If EPA does it, it'll be thoroughly vetted and released, and when they release it. And if they don't get it, since some of the questions and issues that were raised and that OPC and staff were uncomfortable with are embedded in that discussion of how we do the public health analysis, our thought is to simply, you know, hope that EPA gets it finalized and the utilities can apply it to your pilots as the pilot rolls out, rather than do the sort of detailed. I mean, the reason why EPA hasn't finalized it is, you know, they ran into some issues that we've been grappling with here, and you've all commented on. It's a slightly different beast. So there's a lot of technical detail to arrive at that model. And, you know, again, we're happy to do it. It's what we do at RAP with all of you, but we'd have to, you know, move through it all with you. And our thinking is that might be a little bit too much of a task at this point for the work group.
Yeah, so is there a date roughly when that new model, can you get a sense for it? Is that something we should revisit 6 months from now, or, you know, prior to the project's going live in 2022?
Yeah, we have asked EPA, and they can't commit to a date at this point. So that's why we're not sure.
Okay.
And we're not sure if it would be out in time that you could use it, in which case you wouldn't use it.
So that would be something that we would review as a working group sometime in the future prior to the project's going live in 2022, something like that.
Our recommendation would be if EPA releases it, the order just say that the utilities apply it and to their final report. You'll have very good data to apply it to, I believe.
Okay. Right, and we'll have to review the application just to make sure everyone's on the same page on that application, right, at that time. So that's a future working group meeting to discuss that calculator when it becomes available or finalized, right?
If I can jump in, I think what Dave was saying was that there wouldn't be necessarily need to be the meeting because it would be fully vetted. You would just use it when it became available.
Yeah, the only question I have there is, do you think the calculator will be such that it'll be easily translatable and just be a pro forma calculation at that point for PJM?
Oh, well, for the joint utilities, I think it would be. Yeah, EPA is designing it to apply to, you know, battery pilots charging and discharging. So, I mean, to battery projects. So I think it would be directly applicable when and if it is released by the EPA. I mean, the energy efficiency one is, you know, very
right,
very
because Yeah, the earlier version of the model we had to interpret, right, in terms of the application. So this one, if you think that it's sufficient, then that's fine, certainly fine by us, if it's clear on its face, right? Yeah. Okay.
So Dave, you're saying that this updated EPA model in the future is going to actually delineate between on and off peak? Because I think that's, I mean, when staff reviewed the public health benefits, that was where we ran into trouble, was because we were using a 24-hour. Part of, I think, our problem is we were using a 24-hour estimate as off peak, but it had basically on peak values inside of it inherently, which then caused that delta between an on and off to never basically be beneficial for storage. So I guess my question is you're confident that this model that's coming out is going to make that differentiation work? And then second, has EPA assured you, because I mean, to Steve's point, we won't, I guess I have a little bit of reluctance just straight up accepting the model without some sort of review at a later date, just because I would not want us to have double counting between our emissions benefits and our public health benefits and a couple other things if certain values are being tracked. So just, I don't know if that's, I think the utilities could probably weed that out, but I guess it's just a question of does that lend itself to needing at least one work group discussion in the future when this is released?
Yeah. So I two questions. One is no, EPA hasn't assured me of anything. I mean, that's not, you know, they'll be very careful since they haven't decided what they're going to do to be careful there. But they have run into some of the same issues that we're grappling with, and in realizing that a resource that both charges and discharges, you know, is different in how you modeling it than a passive resource like energy efficiency on peak and off peak. So I'm on that issue. I would say I'm quite, you know, I'll be looking at it when it comes out, whenever it comes out. The joint utilities will be, and I'm quite confident that if it isn't a simple application to our projects, that the joint utilities and we would be able to bring it both forward for us to look at the technical issues. I'm just reluctant to build in another process that we may not need if that's not the case. So I mean, that's why we're recommending that it be adopted. We're not sure what, you know, whether the time frame is and whether it will come out. On your second issue, which is double counting, you know, in this area of air pollutants, it's, you know, I would argue it's not double counting at all, because when you're measuring NOx and carbon and SOx benefits, that's a measure of how much the emissions are going down. But when you're measuring public health benefits, you're actually using a more sophisticated model that starts with the emissions and ends up tracking through how those impact people. And, you know, based on very good epidemiological measures. So they're different analysis, one more complicated than another, of how air pollution manifests itself. There's not double counting there, so to speak. You're counting things in a different way. And
maybe, I mean, but at the same time, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I know, and I would have to talk with our Empower evaluator, but I know he has to be careful when we're like, I think I'm reading on here, we're using Empower's value for CO2. And so if it might be that CO2 is the public health benefit of CO2 is actually already assumed inside of that. We might not be thinking that, but I think he might. So I think what I'm saying is it would be I guess I'm just looking at it as we could possibly run into double counting issues, maybe not, but I just know he has to go through, at least he has to bend over backwards sometimes to break a couple of these things apart. And so I guess I'm just not sure if the public health benefit's built in there or not. But yeah, if you don't think it is, but
we can do it with your consultant. You know, I can get, you know, pointing out my former environmental commissioner hat, as air geeky as you want to. I am resisting the temptation to jump into what's driving each model here and outcomes, but I'm happy to do that with your consultant, and I'm quite sure if we go through it that we'll come out, you know, all on the same page here.
I can also just shoot him an email to see if he knows off the top of his head, because he might already be able to tell us no or yes. And so,
Yeah, I mean, the dollar, we do have to, as Steve may say, I know he said it in writing, for the joint utilities, we need to decide how we're going to value NOx, which is not itself a particulate, but can become a particulate. Same thing with SOx. So we have to decide what dollar value we're putting on them. Those will probably come from markets. That's a different valuation than how many people are put in the hospital and die prematurely. So, I mean, in theory, you could argue one subsuming the other. As a public, public health, environmental person, they're not the same. And, the number of people, one is much greater than the other, which is the health impact. So anyway, I will not get any more air geeky, but we're happy to work it through with you and the joint utilities and OPC and any stakeholders that want to be a part of this. And I know that for technical advice, we have the Maryland Department of the Environment on as well. So I don't know that they can speak, but they're available as a technical resource as well.
Actually, that's what I was trying to do a few minutes ago, was send Kathy Winnis a link, which I tried to do. I'm not sure if she's on the call yet or not.
She told me that
Steve's on.
she was on the YouTube, but not on the WebEx.
She wasn't happy with the YouTube, so she emailed me, and I tried to send her, forward her an invitation. So if anyone else can forward her invitation as well, maybe she'll receive it, because it was coming from my personal email.
Okay.
But I guess this is a question to council. I don't think staff council's on the phone call, but I know Mr. Cleaver's on the call and Council for the Utilities. There's annual reporting by the utilities under the statute, July 1 of every year, which of course includes emission reductions. That's number 47 under H7 Romanet I. So what is the thought as far as these annual reports? I would think that would provide the other parties an opportunity to do whatever they needed to do with respect to the information that's reported on. I guess that, Ben, since you don't have counsel with you, I don't want to put you on the spot, but it seemed like you were looking for an opportunity to be able to go over whatever the utilities were then using, and I would think there'd be an opportunity there, but there's nothing really in the statute as far as...
I would have to talk with our counsel, but I mean, yeah, as long as there's a way to, if we think that it should be done differently, we can deal with it. I think I don't know where Steve might have been going, but if it's done ahead of time in a collaborative manner, then it's a lot easier than us sending data requests on the back end to figure out what's going on. Right. And it will all depend on who's on staff at that time. So I do find value in just doing a quick check-in, but at the same time, I'm not married to it because I have plenty of other work groups I have to work with. So
yeah, I mean, I guess I understand what you're saying, that it'd be easier if you knew up front. I guess I was just saying that my interpretation of the statute wouldn't be in there for reporting if there wasn't the ability to do something with that reporting. So there would at least be a backup way of dealing with that. Mr. Cleaver, you care to comment? Do you agree with me? Disagree? Mr. Cleaver's not.
Your Honor, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Looking at the statute, Your Honor, could you? I'm sorry, I don't know if I totally understood your question. Could you ask it again?
Sure. So under H7 Romanet I 47, one of the things the utilities have to report on annually starting in July of 2023 is any emissions reductions. So if I'm sorry, we moved on to health benefits, but I would think there is another category under which this would fall. There should, yeah. 42, any other identified benefits, including resiliency and societal benefits. Arguably, if they start using the EPA health benefits calculator and report on in their July reporting, and there's questions about it or how it was used. My point was just that if there's not the ability to have a working group meeting prior to the reporting would seem to offer an opportunity for parties to comment after. Maybe not as ideal, but at least you wouldn't be foreclosed from future comment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's entirely clear from the statute, but I would expect the commission to allow that, particularly in that circumstance, if it's a, methodology that hasn't really previously been considered and, reported on by the working group.
Yeah, we'll go to 48. Any other information required by the commission, and then I don't know what happened to Romanet 1, but Romanet 4 says after receiving comments from all parties, the commission shall determine. So it seems to imply that after reporting there'd be comments, right? You wouldn't think that's just related to other
Yeah, no,
information.
I see what you're saying, Your Honor. That seems right.
Okay. So that's just, again, that's sort of a backstop. So the working group, I don't think, would be recommending something that the parties would never have the ability to look back on. If we're saying, hey, that we think this health benefits calculator hopefully will come out that is directly applicable to storage and can be used, we want that to be used, but it wouldn't prevent parties from looking at it later and revisiting it.
I would
That's just
agree with that.
that's my thought.
Okay. I would agree with that. Yes.
All right.
But hey, this is Steve. The one thing I would say though is if there's any controversy about this item, helpful to know about it in advance so that to the extent that we can have a consensus position going into that reporting, it's much better rather than kind of redo a report that we've already issued. So that is helpful. So we'll just have to be mindful of that as we go forward.
I think the way then to do it is as soon as it comes out, I don't know how you become aware of it, but would be to engage the other parties prior to reporting.
Yeah, it might make sense, and that way, if there's anything else at that time, we could also cover that item as well. So better to be in consensus when we begin that report out rather than have to redo a prior report that we've provided, right?
Right. But I
Yeah.
don't think there's certainly in any case before the commission, there's nothing that prevents the parties from getting together and discussing an issue in the case mid-report. Right. So say something comes out that you're going to start using, that you could contact all the parties and say, this model just came out, we propose to use it, and it can be discussed.
Right. That's true as well.
Ben, were you going to say something?
I was just going to ask, Your Honor, are you recommending basically in the work group report that we would have something along the lines of this would be the intent once it's available, the utilities will inform the parties either before or when they file their data that they've revised their methodologies to incorporate it and provide an explanation of what they did? Is that what you're envisioning as the recommendation here?
Yes, if the utilities, that would be the working group's recommendation. If the utilities, review that language and they're fine with it, then that's what we would go with. Yes.
Okay. And then on a, I guess, other point before such calculator is released, we're here hoping it is, but let's say it's not, is the idea that we're dropping the public health benefit, we're sticking with what we have, or do parties have a different recommendation? I guess, Steve, you had submitted comments that we should review the latest health benefit calculator. I guess, did you have any ideas of what you were thinking when you made that recommendation as what we should be looking at or looking for in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that all of the parties had an opportunity to review that health benefits calculator before we started relying on it for the reports, right? So we didn't want to rely on it in one way and have it interpreted by another party in a different manner, right? So that we are all having a consensus on how to apply that. And I think the discussion we've just had, we'll have that opportunity before the first report out with that measure, right? So that we can at least have a reasonable consensus to the extent we can get there on how to report that rather than go back and readjust something that we've already reported, right?
But if for some reason the EPA health benefits calculator doesn't come out prior to your first reporting, I think there's going to be no calculation of health benefits.
That's right. There would be no calculation at that point until that calculator came out, right?
Does that answer your question, Ben?
I think it does. Yeah.
Okay. I think we're ready to move on to utility distribution deferral.
Yeah.
The utility comment on this was pretty self-explanatory, but however, I had a question. The cost threshold for tracking and reporting of distribution upgrade costs is proposed to be 1 million. I don't know who wants to speak on behalf of the utilities. I'd like a little to understand better the $1 million. Was that already included in your cost estimate? Is that in addition to? Talk to us about the 1 million.
Right, Justin, you want to comment on that $1 million threshold thought?
Sure. I mean,
Yeah.
so the thought is, for the $1 million is just to make sure these are significant investments that would, materially impact the view on the economics of these projects. So that's was determined. There should be some kind of threshold so that, replacing, small replacements, things like that, or things that don't meet the level that are significance for the wider group. We set at $1 million so that there's some kind of threshold.
Judge Lawrence, I think the thesis behind this is Tom Shetty. The thesis behind it, basically, as you know, we are saying we are deferring the big, large capital spend. That is driving the benefits. Now, what this is saying is, if there is any capital spend as opposed to what we stated, which was 0, and the threshold is 1 million. If it's anything and beyond 1 million, we'll report it. Less than that, any trivial number will not be. That is the point we are trying to make. If that helps.
I don't know if that helps or not. OPC, does that help you?
It sounds like, if I understood what Mr. Shetty just explained, it sounds like, so this is when, if I'm understanding this $1 million threshold is when utilities have identified some deferral value, but the traditional investment fee isn't able to be deferred to the extent the utilities thought, as long as the costs in that regard are less than $1 million, the utilities don't have to report it. Is that right, Tom?
No, I will let me. This might be. I'll probably use a little illustrative. The numbers might be off. Okay, so for the National Harbor project, what we are saying is the substation cost roughly 75 million. That will be deferred by X number of years. That is a statement. So what this means is, when you look at the utility cost on a capital cost, there is no cost for the foreseeable future until we start building the substation. So what we are, so that is the fact. So now what we are saying is, if during the interim period, if we do have a capital spend, which was supposed to be 0 because we are deferring it, if that we'll only report it if that capital spend, which was supposed to be 0, it exceeds the 1 million mark. In other words, if we have a $50,000 a feeder or a switch changes, a trivial amount which will not have basically any movement on the deferral calculation, we would not report. That's all we are saying. It is not even deferral, it is the capital spend, the small capital spend relative to the substation, which was 70 million, which is being deferred. We will not report it as long as it's less than $1 million. You need to look at the 1 million in the context of what is being deferred, which is 70+ million. If that helps. Steve, you want to add? Justin, you want to add in? I think I was just using an illustrative example to articulate my point.
Yep.
That's fine. Yeah, let me just jump in. We did not want to report just kind of de minimis kind of adjustments to the system, right? So the idea is to put a threshold level in there that says anything above that level we'll track and report out. Anything below that level is so de minimis that it's not critical to the project deferral calculations. So that's kind of our thinking at this point.
Yep. And another nuance here, Justin, is that we state here it's to serve forecasted load growth. So this wouldn't be necessarily investments where we're replacing equipment that's end of useful life or reliability, repair. These are for, dealing with low growth, over voltage, which these projects are addressing. Storage and the deferrals, those are addressing, where the voltage is hitting, bumping up against the rated amounts. Just day-to-day reliability stuff would not be included as part of this submission. So that $1 million and also the type of investment.
Would there be willingness to change that threshold to maybe $500,000?
You know, I'd be
$500,000.
interested what other people have to say. I mean, there, you know, I'm not going to give you an elaborate calculation on how we came to 1 million. So it's up for interpretation, and be interested to see what the other candidates, if they think it creates additional value, then we can have that discussion.
Yeah.
I mean, using the National Harbor as another example. So you're projecting 1% overload potential in 2027 and 2% in 2028.
Yes, sir.
So these these investments, whether it's up to $1 million or $500,000, aren't necessarily related to that load growth, as you said. They're more end of useful life and other just failure of equipment that's not driven by load growth on the circuit.
What we said was, we will manage we don't need to spend money on the substation, which is $70 million. That is the basis of a deferral calculation, because we are pushing that expenditure by X number of years. That is the thesis. But now after the fact, let's assume after 1 year, we end up spending some money, which is the threshold we are talking about. We start spending money that indirectly basically saying the deferral is low than what we stated. That is the message it is conveying. And by using the $1 million threshold, we are saying the reason we picked 1 million is that 1 million compared to the 70 odd million would not move the deferral calculation. But the same token, we have to be transparent and say, we assume 74 million will be deferred. Actually, it is 73 million because we spent 1 million because we had to do some upgrade to manage whatever that issue is on that feeder or substation. That feeder, that's what we're trying to say. In other words, we deviated than what we assumed on April 15th filing. And I think we believe that is a very important information the stakeholders should know. And that is the reason we are providing that information. But we don't want to be providing for every trivial dollars. And that's the reason the 1 million threshold came into the equation, if that helps.
Yeah, no, thank you. That makes perfect sense. And so you'd also indicated updating kind of load forecasts. And so for this particular project, we would want to know, is the load changing in such a way that it's maybe increasing more quickly than expected, that therefore the battery project might not be able to defer the investments? So
that's right. You're right. We already provided the load projection, which was baked, which we used to come up with the deferral. I don't know whether staff have asked part of the data request. I don't recollect. I do know that I provided that. So that was developed say in 2020. Similarly, as for the reporting period, each year we'll be providing the new load forecast the company develops. So once you can look at that load forecast, you also know what is the firm capacity and how much is the overload, and you can see whether the deferral opportunity still exists or not. I think it is you can do that. You don't need, you can easily, it's pretty transparent. It's pretty straightforward.
Gotcha. No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Tom, is the 1 million annually?
Yeah, 1 million. Yeah, 1 million annual. That is where we are going. But obviously, it will be up. You will have the information every year we provide, and if you see 1 million each year, then there will be obviously data requests explaining. We will provide the explanation of what is happening. Yeah, that we are thinking of 1 million each year.
Your Honor, I need to take it back to my engineers, but I think that's probably too high on the face, because National Harbor is definitely the most expensive of the upgrades we talked about, but most of them don't get into that dollar threshold. So I think it would be good to know more by what distribution project we're looking at, not as much as I don't need to know every transformer that's going in. I agree. I think that's where that's getting too granular, I think. But I think it would be
what if the threshold was a percentage?
Maybe that might be the appropriate approach. But I don't, and this is why I need to talk with my engineers to figure out. Maybe they agree that $1 million is when we start caring about really knowing what they were doing, and everything else falls under it. National Harbor was the most expensive of the crew, and that was also for 3 batteries deferring a whole substation. So I mean, I'm reluctant to agree at this time to $1 million threshold. So that's just putting that out there.
Just for reference, so I just looked back at my files. So the avoidance for the Fairhaven and Chesapeake projects was $15 million undergrounding project. And I think the value we put for the avoidance was in the neighborhood of 17 million nominal, about thereabouts dollars. So give us some sense of the $1 million versus the the avoided value that we're talking about.
Yeah. So I'm not saying it's completely inappropriate. I need to talk with the engineers. They might agree completely, but it just on knowing BG and them were lower. I just need to think about that because
that's let us know.
Yeah.
I mean, OPC. I mean, along the lines of what Dr. Latundra said. The $1 million seems too high. I mean, I'm looking at the Exelon initial applications and looking at National Harbor. The deferral value is looks like 7.7 million. Is that right? Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, subject to check. Subject to check. I don't have the figures. If you're looking at the filing, it should be. Yeah, it rings a bell. Yeah, I agree.
I mean, a change in $1 million. That's more than 10% of the deferral value. So that seems
I would no that. I'm sorry, and I'm going to correct you if you don't mind. No, you need to look at the 1 million against the 70 odd million, because the 70 odd million gets multiplied by the annual carrying charge. So in other words, you're reducing the 7 million was the deferral value because we delayed the 70 million investment. So now instead of 70 million investment, we are delaying $69 million of investment. I'm trying to simplify it a little bit, so I might be off, but I'm trying to convey the message. So the 69, then the deferral value will change far less. It will be probably, my guess is, without using the calculator or without using Excel, it will be like 6.9 or 6, somewhere instead of 7 million, it will be lower value. That's all it is. It's a percentage of the capital being deferred.
Tom,
yes.
Just maybe back up for a second, and maybe this is thinking about when you go through your distribution, when you're planning your system every year and you're doing your forecast. I'm assuming your engineers make a forecast and they say, here's the things we need to do in order to serve the load at this circuit or feeder, I'm assuming, right?
That's right.
Do they, because I mean, it won't be useful to look through every single one of those, but is there, I'm just trying to figure out if that list is available and that can be made, if that can be provided to the parties upon request for them to look at, but then we agree to a threshold, maybe that's an approach. I'm just trying to think, because I'm trying to figure out, is there a way to more qualitatively get at that instead of from a dollar value? Because when I think about these projects, to Justin's point, or maybe it was yours, I think we are looking at did something get built that we thought wasn't going to get built because you put in the storage. And so that feels very qualitative in nature. So just trying to think of what's the right information for us to look at to make that judgment call. And you will also look at it and make that judgment call as well. So I assume that when the engineers put those projects together, they say, here's why I want to do it with a little blurb. Is this something that maybe we use that as our threshold if there's mentions of things like load growth or whatever else we were trying to solve with the storage project, instead of and maybe that's getting too detailed in terms of what would have to be reviewed before it's filed. But I think I'm just trying to get to the qualitative portion, which is where I think we really will determine if the storage succeeded or not and what it planned to do.
Yeah, Ben, is that I'm just asking a question. Is your concern, is it the 1 million is too high, or is it, as OPC mentioned, Joe mentioned, the 500 would be more comfortable for you? Because if that, I don't know whether the dollar or the details is what you're looking for. I'm not very clear where you're coming from.
I think the details will be more, the dollars will be eventually important, obviously, because we're going to say, okay, was it cost effective or not? But the details are going to tell us, did the storage do what it was supposed to do? Because you obviously are going to have to do work on these feeders over time, right? And so there's no question about that, but not all the work you're going to do. And hopefully with the storage end, it means that there's going to be work you never had to do. And so I guess that's what I'm getting to, which is, I know we're thinking about this as a dollar amount or a percentage amount, and maybe that's the appropriate approach, but just trying to think of really what I would assume what we're trying to get to is qualitatively, did we avoid the distribution upgrades that we planned to, or did we not, I guess.
Okay, we will see what my colleagues can weigh in. Yeah, we'll see what we have to go back to the drawing board and see what is available.
Hey, Tom, yeah, why don't we go back and on the PHI side at least talk to our distribution planners
and
about what they might have available, and what their guidance might be in terms of dropping it down to 500,000, that kind of thing. We'll go back and revisit that. Yeah.
And also the details, what Ben was looking. So I hear the way I'm drawing the conclusion is there's a dollar threshold to be a little lower, and also some additional details so that the stakeholders can make informed judgment on how we are proceeding. Is that a fair assertion conclusion I'm drawing?
I think so. Yeah, I think, because I mean, at a certain point, yeah, $20,000 investments that's getting to the nitty gritty. So I don't think anyone will have time for that, but also a little bit of detail around the things will make parties' lives easier when looking at us.
Yeah, I think we'll see, but there is another checkpoint too, because if it's a certain dollars, it'll be capitalized, Ben. So obviously, when we come for recovery, there's another point of visibility there too. It's not that we can sneak in, we can put in something without the visibility. It's going to be capitally visible.
Yeah, I was not attempting to worry about if you were inappropriately recovering cost. Yeah.
Sorry for my apologies for my language, but you understand.
So. Okay. So I heard because we have a couple of things to get back to, and we'll turn this around very quickly. I know we're there's a lot of things on the table.
All right.
Yeah, we appreciate a quick turnaround. Up to optionality. It looks as though the utilities still agree with the metric that the working group put forward, but they addressed staff's comment with regard to updating the load forecast. Was that your interpretation, I guess, Ben?
Yeah, the only question I had was, so if you'll give us an update of the forecast, and then when we get to 2022, 2023, 2024, you'll tell us here's the load that actually occurred.
I think they have to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Then. Yeah, I think that's fine. I don't know.
The only thing we'd point out is that the load forecast for engineering purposes is different than the actuals, right? So the actuals are just what the actual weather conditions are and what the loads are. The forecast is typically 90-10, right? So you're forecasting for more extreme conditions so that you can meet the load requirements. So just FYI, there's a little bit of a difference between the two, right?
Well,
yes, but I think we need to document that at least so that parties, when they look at it, they see that, I guess. Because I do agree, you need to overbuild your system for margin. Otherwise, things will break when we hit something. So I don't think we want to not do that.
So just recognize that.
I think, Ben, you would probably appreciate the very fact, the load forecast which you saw as part of your data request in 2020, and the future future load forecast. If there is a variation, that means the optionality exists, because that is the changes to the load forecast is driving the optionality. You know that pretty well. So you will see that.
Yeah, and so maybe, I don't know if your distribution planners can tell you this or not, if they come up with a point in time and then they increase it for that 1 in 10 event that they're watching out for, or if they just immediately go to the 1 in 10 and they don't think about saying here's the average and here's the above. But maybe that is something that could be provided if it exists. I'm not saying going out of our way, but just maybe then you're focusing, then you're saying here's the planning peak, but here's the average, but that's not obviously actuals never happen relative to the forecast, or forecasts never actually happen.
Oh, right. Because we're planning for the 90-10, right? So yeah.
So yeah, all I'm trying to get to, Steve, is how we make it useful for evaluating the optionality, I guess.
Yeah, so our thought had been, and Tom, you jump in here too, but had been that what we would do is provide the forecast, which is the basis for the engineering build out to meet the loads. And that would be what you would be most interested in, because that really is what drives optionality, right? And it's those changes in that load forecast that are going to give you a sense of what kind of optionality we're getting, right?
Yes, I think so. I think the only caveat I put on that, and this is, I think, what I was maybe just asking, is if there's a way to normalize them, or not normalize is the right word, but to say, here's we plan for the 1 in 10 forecast. I'm trying to figure out a way to put that 1 in 10 forecast in alignment with actual weather events that are occurring in a normal way. And I'm trying to think how to get that across, or how to look at that so that when we look at it, somebody can say, okay, you were within your 1 in 10 bound. No, actually you were outside of it, or you were well below it, in which case your forecast was too far off. And I'm just trying to think how we get to that without going through all your planning detail and making your life really hard.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, so we thought the 1 in 10 forecast was really the thing that you wanted to look at. A little bit difficult to think about how each individual peak forecast basically gives you what you want, because it's kind of a different animal a little bit. So something to think a little bit further about.
Right. I think here's how I was trying to say it. I think I was asking, do your distribution planners get to a peak and then scale that peak up for a 1 in 10 emergency, in which case all we would have to do is scale it down, or do they or is that nowhere in the equation? I guess I get when I say, I mean, they never create what would be considered a quote unquote average year. They just create the 1 in 10. I guess that's what I was trying to understand. Because if you have the average with the 1 in 10, then you can see the entire forecast.
So we have we have the actual peaks, we have the weather normalized peaks, and then we have the load forecast going forward for distribution planning purposes. And the last one is the one that drives optionality. You have to think about whether we could provide anything else that would provide helpful guidance.
So we can come back to you with that on that as well. I mean, so I just want to make sure I crystallize. If we were to provide a 50-50 forecast and a 90-10, would that be sufficient for what you're asking, Ben?
I think so. That's where I'm going, okay. Justin.
All right, so we'll get back to you on that.
We'll check them. Okay.
Yeah, and
that.
Oh, go ahead.
That same quick turnaround, right, Justin?
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah. Facts are
utility
easy to
speed. Utility speed.
Until there's a storm.
And I want to make sure I understand this optionality piece, because the Utilities and the Energy Storage Association, Nissan, were very involved in it. But is the way it would work is if the forecast actually changes, so it ends up being less than was anticipated, then what is the optionality value? Is the optionality value the full value of the avoided distribution system build, or is it something else? What's the calculation or value there?
That is the value, because when we did the initial deferral calculation, it was a deterministic model. We assumed the load forecast is going to hit in this particular year. I'm going to get 3 years of deferral. But now what happens is, then we come back and say there is an X percentage of probability this would occur or this would not occur. This would not occur means the load forecast did not materialize. What that means is my battery would be sufficed and I can get an additional year of deferral. So because the load forecast is dynamic, but in the initial assessment, we said it is a deterministic or a single point of value. But when we do the optionality, we're basically saying there's only a certain percentage this would occur. and if it does not occur, then it provides the additional deferral value. Obviously, we multiply it by that 50% because there's only 50% probability we occur. I can talk offline and provide you some background how we came up with
I'm
that.
following you. And if you decided the entire project would have become unnecessary, then it would be the full value of the project, if I'm following your reasoning.
That is right, but we did not get into that level of that's it. Ours only looked at a few years. The tree, if I can use those, basically it's like a binomial tree. It is like it has only like 3 layers or 3 layers. It doesn't have extended so far farther away. It's rather somewhat simplistic, if I can use those words.
Understood. Thanks.
And sorry, not to get too technical, but the Fairhaven and CHP projects were in avoidance, so the optionality calculation was a little different than them. We may not have time to go through it, but I can explain that to people offline.
Yeah, Your Honor, on the optionality in terms of how we do it going forward, I know staff had concerns with how it was used in the analysis. So I don't think we would say that what's in the report is wrong, because I agree it's a probability. I think our main concern came in with the use of 50-50 out of the report that it was derived from. So I think it's when we do this kind of work in the future, I think we would want that probability to be revisited. But I'm not saying, but really going forward at this point, because we've now given them the utilities the permission to build these, it's now just a question of, did it materialize or did it not materialize? And that's what I'm looking for on the tracking side of this.
Yeah, and the optionality benefit is going to vary by project, right? So that 50-50 split is going to change based on changes to the forecast, that kind of thing, right? So each project will look different potentially. Yeah.
But I think Steve, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that, you can only get data prospectively and look back, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Just turn it over to OPC real quick. I want to make sure that your comment has been addressed to the extent we can do so.
Yeah, no, that was discussion was helpful to us. We didn't really delve too deeply into this, and was kind of following the staff's lead on clarifying that probability is embedded within the optionality calculations.
Okay, are we ready to move on now?
Judge Lawrence?
Yes.
I hate to backtrack. Could I ask a clarifying question about the deferral value item?
Of course.
And Justin made a comment about this earlier, but I may not have caught it. I'm looking at the utilities response, and this comment here about it's the third sentence. BGE and PEPCO proposed to track distribution system upgrades to serve forecasted load growth on the substation's feeders affected by the availability of energy storage through the duration of the pilot program. So is that, in stating that, are you stating a limitation on the types of costs that you're expecting to, that you're willing to track? I guess stated differently, is any part of the deferral costs as presented to the commission in your application associated with avoided upgrades or replacements for reasons other than load growth? And if so, are you stating here that you won't be tracking that? Understand my question? Maybe this is best for Justin, because I think you mentioned this.
Yeah, so I think I'll address the best I can, and the technical folks can correct me if needed. But the avoided, both the storage asset as well as the avoided investment are both related to load growth. So that's the relevant use case and value that's here, and so that's why we're also tracking it. That's the purpose, to provide more capacity to the lines. So that limitation is not to allow for replacement of parts, repairs, things like that, which are not relevant to load growth. And then the other limitation here is on the feeders that are relevant. So we're not talking about upgrades across our system, but just to the feeders that are downstream and impacted by the storage, or would be benefiting the same way. And then that was that $1 million threshold. So I guess those are 3 limitations we create on there. So these limitations should not exclude any investments that would be material to the deferral or avoidance calculations in our BCA.
Yes, Joe. I think if the feeder, for example, for a bad weather, it breaks for, for a wind comes in and knocks it off, that is nothing to do with capacity overloads. So that piece will not be part of this disclosure. On the other hand, for something, there was a load growth and, and our feeder, could not manage it and we had to harden it, then that is something we have to disclose it. If I can, I'm using simplistic. My engineers are on there. They can correct me if I misstated, but that is my simplistic example.
No, thanks. That's thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So the next item I had was energy conservation during time of peak. And utilities placed a comment in here. I don't know if staff or OPC have any questions with regard to that.
I don't think so. I just wanted to verify that you're going to do what you're describing for the megawatt hours. You're going to be doing that with the price as well. That you're, I guess, in the calculation for value.
Can you define price?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm.
Are you saying? Yeah.
So I think what I'm thinking is, so like when you avoid the peak hours, there's going to be $1 per megawatt hour you're avoiding paying at that time, correct? So I guess I'm just asking, where are we going to be capturing that portion of it in terms of the avoided value of the energy at that hour? Because I know right now we're using the Empower values, I think, but I would assume we would use actuals in that scenario. So I guess I just was asking where that was getting tracked, I guess.
So we'll be tracking the energy, right? And so the dollar values of that energy, we can either use the Empower values or we can use the actual market data at that point in time, right? So yeah, we'll be tracking the energy, and then the dollar values of that will be either the actuals or based on the Empower calculations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
got it.
You're saying or, but we have in here that Empower assumed values would be used. So should that be changed to or market values?
Well, this is Steve. I think it's easier to rely on the Empower values because they've been vetted, and we do recognize that those change over time. If you want to cut over to actuals, then that would be a little more complicated to actually then report out because we'd have to vary that, and that would differ than what the commission would see on the Empower side.
So, Your Honor, I think I'll take it back, but I think I would prefer to see market, but this is only once it's occurred, not in the forecast, if that makes, so not that we'd be revising this for when we're doing evaluation to build these things, but when we're talking about when we start, I guess in the prospective gathering of data, we'll know what had occurred. I think that was why I was asking this question, was because the utilities, I think how I read what the utilities are going to provide, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, you're basically going to say in January, in hour 1, this is how much we charged across the entire month, hour 2, and you're not going to really differentiate between, you're not going to provide an 8760, you're going to provide 12 24-hour blocks aggregated, correct? I think that's
right. It's right, blocks, and is what we were thinking.
And differentiating between charging and discharging, so you can see how much is charged and how much is discharged.
Right. And so I think I was just wondering, because I think I had always presumed this part when once we were actually operating in the market, we would be able to then align that with the actual energy cost that was avoided instead of having to use the Empower stuff. But if parties had a different view of that, I'm not locked in because I wasn't here when these discussions were had a year ago. So
yeah, just to clarify your thinking, are you suggesting LMP values, or what are you suggesting at that point?
I would assume I would think it would be the LMP or whatever market node that storage gets paid from, I guess. So I don't know if it would. I'm trying to think if it would get paid at any other location than the LMP, but maybe one of your market folk know better than I do.
Right. It could be a zone. I mean, for Empower, we're really using zonal related data.
Right.
So we might want to use zonal data, but we can talk about that.
Yeah, I'm not wedded to one or the other yet. I just was, I think my mind had always been, we'll just use the market data when we get there. And so if parties had a different view, we should discuss that. But that was just where I was thinking about this originally. So I wanted to know how that was getting translated into this.
Right, because in Empower it blocks it into blocks, right? The on off peak hours, and so there's price blocks there. And here you're suggesting a more granular approach on LMPs, so we can think a little bit further about that as well.
Because of course when we did the original recommendation, it was for evaluation, but we gave some thought to going forward as well. But if it needs to be updated at this point to be market and not based on Empower, we need to know that sooner rather than later.
Yeah, we'd want to make that probably a statement here if that's the decision that we collectively make. We just want to spend a little more time thinking about the ramifications of that. And if we were to do that, I would recommend that we would do it on a zonal basis for each of the utilities rather than nodes. But we can think about that.
I mean, just on the market side, the market will require, there's probably a lot of nuance to that. So, to come up with the market number will be, require a number of assumptions, so for instance, if it's LMP, I guess we would do a weighted average of the whole month across that 1 hour time block. And I do feel like it would create a lot of churn, and there's probably a lot of judgment calls, what is truly a price in some of these instances. So just something to be aware, not that we're 100% opposed to us, but reasons we like the Empower is that it is vetted and it's also transparent and simple as we are putting this together. So that was just further thinking on our side.
Right. I guess when you think about this, I guess I just was figuring you'll know the hours you were operating and how you were operating. And so before you do that aggregate, you would be able to, if we had an agreement, if we were going to use zonal or LMP, you would just say, here are the prices at that time and sum it together. I don't know how automated your processes are going to be, though. So obviously, the more automated we make it, then the more functionality needs to be built into that cost.
Yeah. So just a quick comment there. It does increase the complexity of the reporting a bit. And whether or not that complexity increase is worth it or not. I don't know that it provides you a significant amount of additional data. That's the only thing we'd point out.
This is Nissan. I'll just chime in and say that I think when we'd originally envisioned this pilot as a mechanism for testing out different business models, I think one of the hypotheses that we put forward was that we want to test out which models yield the best savings for ratepayers. And so I do think it would go against the intent of the pilot not to do an eventual true up from the estimate, which should use Empower, to actual revenues realized. And I don't think if we didn't use actual revenues or some proxy for those, we wouldn't be able to have a fair policy discussion about the business models.
Yeah, so Nissan, this isn't revenues, right? This is just kind of the savings effect related to the operation of the battery. And so we'll have actuals. The only thing we just need to think about is the granularity of reporting here, right? And so we'll have actual megawatt hour data, right? And the only extent is if we want to go into the full LMP calculation, certainly wouldn't recommend node, but could certainly think about it. But how much additional value you're going to get out of that data point is the only question for the additional work, right?
Yeah, and I think truing up to the Empower numbers may be difficult because I think there's a lot of elements as part of those calculations.
Yeah, Empower makes a bunch of forward assumptions about price based on the SOS bid prices, that kind of thing. So
and transmission savings, things like that, I think are also embedded in there.
Yeah, I don't know. Am I coming through? This is David Blow from BG. And I can't tell which metric exactly we're talking about here, but I guess I'm curious where Ben was from staff to the cost to who, like who is the benefit that we're trying to measure here? Because I think Empower does a pretty good job of doing that, valuing the energy price here. So that's is where I'm landing. I guess I'm trying to better understand whose benefit.
I mean, there's two ways to look at this. I do view this as, so if we're looking at it from the ratepayer's perspective, and those charges are only going to get passed on to the ratepayer through their SOS prices, then maybe Empower's the correct way, and I just need to think about it that way. But if we're looking at it from an entity that would have had to pay, then you wouldn't want to use the SOS price because that's really a rolling 2-year average that's not really correlated to the market at that point. And so therefore, it would not actually inform you the actual cost you avoided. It would really Empower is telling you what the customer avoided with that energy price. Because it's basically the SOS price escalated. So it's not so if the SOS price is known, I don't think I would need to ask Dan to weigh in if it's how we get to the on versus off peak portion of that. But typically those the energy price is really just SOS.
And so just for clarity, you're advocating use of the wholesale market LMP value here is what you were thinking, right?
That's what I was thinking,
Okay.
but I also, as I said all this, I had to think, I don't think I asked myself, am I looking at this from the ratepayer's perspective or am I looking at this from the business owner's perspective? If I'm the business owner, I care about the LMP price. If I'm the ratepayer, I really just care if you avoided me having to pay SOS at that point in time. So that's what I needed to ask myself and think about.
Yeah, and I think that's the Empower calculation is, I think, developed by a consultant, and it's because it takes into account this holistic view, if I recall, related to transmission benefits, peak reduction, capacity cost benefits.
Yeah,
which are not, that's a non-trivial calculation, that is done.
Yeah, hey, Justin, it's forward-looking market energy prices, right? So on the Empower side, but yeah, we can take a look at what we would recommend. Just trying not to make it too granular that it becomes cumbersome in reporting and not usable. So just kind of think of it that way as well.
Yeah. I just want to weigh in the same point that Ben just made. I mean, the actual savings to customers are going to, by and large, except for those on competitive supply, be your standard offer prices. And so I think that's important somewhere because to report, but it is for purposes of those that do a lot of these pilots and get involved in the technical detail, the actual market savings, are important because those make a difference. And so I'm not arguing against trying to measure those, but in reality, those are just going to be, what the load serving entities that are serving load would realize. And so I raise that because I'm in thinking about using the Empower figures. They're kind of halfway in between the two. They, may be the perfect fit or they may not fit either need. But it would be, and to the extent that we are going to try to measure LMPs, I agree entirely with Steve's point. I think because this is a distributed resource, zonal is what you want to use, not nodal. We need a zonal figure because, right, they're not discharging or charging at a node. It's somewhere in the zone.
Steve, can I ask is there a reason you wanted to aggregate it versus just say, here's the information, and if you continue to use the Empower data, you use the Empower data, but then parties have the dates and energy discharge, such as if they wanted to go do the zonal calculation, they could.
Yeah,
I guess.
Yeah, so it was a discussion I had really with Justin and thinking about how these projects are going to work. Rather than get into a tremendous amount of detail for reporting here related to hourly, our thinking was blocks of hours would be easier to report out and then to put out the appropriate, pricing information that we agreed on for those blocks. Because you get into too much granularity, it's not really going to provide you that much additional information. So just kind of thinking about how usable the reports will be and how much work would be required to actually develop those reports. That's kind of where we were coming from.
Right. Because this might be a possible compromise or way to maybe ensure that if people want to do the other one, they can, is in the in the report, the main part, you just say, here's the summary, which is this aggregated block. And we agree if it's in power or not in power. And I just need to take that back and think about it. I hadn't tried to look at it from the other direction. But then in an appendix, you just say, here were the dates and the hours, especially on these. I don't think you're going to have more than 10 days a year. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you guys do a lot of peak avoidance.
Well,
But,
yeah, remember how these things are going to operate, right? So the core ones are going to operate for peak shaving, grid emergencies, and then for PJM market purposes. So you're going to have a lot of data for hourly operations, right? Presumably throughout the year for these projects. So just think about the amount of data that we should be providing here and how helpful that is to your kind of evaluation of storage.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm just like, for general public consumption, looking at a table where it's aggregated makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking for this group who might want to get into the minutia of it, if there's a way to get their hands on it, they think that maybe that solves a lot of issues.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Ben, you're arguing for a 8760 file with the charge and discharge?
I mean, for the evaluators looking at this, I don't think that's unreasonable since the data is going to exist. I mean, the utilities can tell me if that's wrong. That doesn't even maybe have to be provided in the write-up. That's just provided as an Excel file upon request or something. We could, but I mean, to me, that seems like a reasonable piece of information to put out there, but I could be told otherwise, so.
Yeah, no, that was of interest to us as well, to have more granular operation data on the systems if possible.
All right. So I think that's something we discussed internally. We just need to reconfirm with our, essentially the third-party contractors, make sure that information won't be too sensitive. And I think we'll get back to you with an answer on that with 8760.
Right.
We were thinking this would provide everything we would need while still sort of, putting it into something a little more bite-sized, but we can come back with the answer again quickly.
Okay. So I think that took care of both energy conservation and peak shaving. The next few lines, 7 through 13, were PJM market activities, which I think staff, and if you go down to line 29, had a comment about PJM analysis of funds generated from wholesale market. And I think that's where the utilities responded to the comment, which relates back to line 7 through 13. So is there anything we need to discuss there, Ben?
The only question I have is this pre or post third-party contract? Is this basically, we'll see everything that happened to the storage, even if it's on a third-party contract, and what that storage got paid from PJM or had to pay PJM, or is it going to be, we'll get that information after the third parties paid themselves? I don't know if the utilities had a time to go back and talk to with the energy storage about their contracts with them and what we can and can't get our hands on.
Yeah, so in our case on the PHI side, we were working through that with the contractors. Our vision is that we would report out kind of what the PJM actual market earnings are. Then we'd be able to tell how much was shared with customers for each project. And what that sharing will be dictated, for example, National Harbor, there's a sharing agreement with the vendor. And so it'll be kind of what that net effect is, right, after adjusting for any applicable PJM charges.
Let me just make sure I heard you right. So utility will get the whole thing, but if it's a contract, it would be after they take their bite.
So our thought, at least on the PHI side, is we would share what the total market earnings were, and then we'd also provide information about how much was shared with customers. You're going to get that anyway in terms of the adjustments to our costs, right? We're going to report that out because that'll be then netted off what the costs that we'll need to get a recovery of later in time.
I think that's great. So yeah, I don't think that's an issue.
We were just curious in getting a little more clarity in terms of the reporting revenues on kind of a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and also wanting to understand that the revenues would be associated with, there'd be a flag in terms of which of the market that those revenues were generated in, whether it's regulation or
Yeah, so
repairs.
our thinking was that this would be reported ideally. Our sense was annually should be sufficient. It certainly wouldn't be daily. It certainly wouldn't be weekly. Recognizing how the PJM markets work. Now they have a PJM delivery year, which is different than, of course, a calendar year. But our thinking was that we would report these numbers out annually as part of the reporting process. But if you think more granularity is needed than annual reports, we could discuss that. That's kind of what our thinking is. And David Bloom on the BGE side, I know you're there as well. Do you have any other comment you want to
I guess
add?
I interpreted his comment to mean you would report annually, but what you reported annually might include a monthly breakdown. Is that what you meant, Steve?
Yes, that was
yes, yeah. So it would be reported out annually. And then in terms of monthly, David, what do you think? Monthly? Back on a monthly basis, how that looks?
Yeah, this is David Bloom from BG, and I think breaking it out monthly should be fine. My only hesitation, I would want to confirm with our other parties, for Chesapeake Beach, for example, Fairhaven, the Fairhaven project, I don't see an issue there. Making sure that the third parties are okay with breaking it down that way, and also just and also Dr. Latendra's question, I think we can provide a breakdown from which market it came from, the revenues came from.
So the idea is we would report out annually, right? Is what our thought was, and then we'll look back, and I think the data should be able to be broken monthly, but again, we'll have to double check that. But you'll have by revenue stream out of the PJM markets, right?
Okay.
Yeah, we will. This is Justin. We'll confirm with our third party. My original think it was annual with annual granularity, but we'll double check and see if monthly would be okay. And by market would be my assumption as well.
Great, thank you.
Steve, you can push back on me, obviously, but if you received a data request wanting to see the hourly payments, is that something we would be able to get our hands on because you would have it, or is that going too far down into the weeds?
Yeah, can you clarify what you mean by that?
Well, I'm not sure. I have to think about this, but I'm just not. For reporting purposes, if I'm filing a report with the commission saying this is what we earned over the last year and here's what we earned monthly, I think that makes a lot of sense. But if somebody's I'm just trying to think if somebody needs what kind of analysis somebody would do that might require them to see the hourly payments from PJM. But if they have the hourly charge and discharge profile, maybe that's enough. I'm just trying to figure out if somebody wanted to see that. I mean, granted, they would have to follow all the confidentiality rules and everything. Would they be able to get their hands on it if requested?
Yeah, so the comment I'd have on that one is I need to reach back to our settlements team to see how those PJM invoice transactions appear, to see what kind of granularity they have, and that I'd have to go back and check on. And David, I know David Bloom is on. I don't know whether he knows the answer to that on the BGE side.
Yes, and this is David Bloom. Hopefully you can hear me a little bit better. Typically we can get PJM reports readily, but not by hour. I believe perhaps by week we could see it, but not the PJM report wouldn't be by hour. We'd have to look at, I think, what you were alluding to before with some of the dispatch hourly data, and then match it up with actual market values at that time.
Yes, right.
Yeah. And one maybe one final point for Ben as he's thinking about this. The thing to think about too is that, over any sort of short period of time, the way that these batteries will work, you'll see the discharging and charging. So the charges and credits will be as such. So, you know, the idea here is that over a longer period of time, that the revenue is more positive. For example, if you just picked a certain period of hours where we were charging, you wouldn't see us actually generating positive revenue during that time. So
Right.
I caution that.
No, I understand that, David. I've done battery modeling before. So I understand what you're saying. I just was trying to figure out if to your point, is there something where I'm trying to think of a stakeholder looking to learn from this pilot? If looking at hourly payment information is something that's helpful to learn a piece of information. I think, and maybe what's more important to know is maybe less about the payment and more about when they were discharging or performing a function. Was it what were they doing at that moment? It's I guess, were you putting it into the reg market, or were you putting it into the I guess energy market? I think maybe that's the probably more appropriate place to be going with such a question, I think. But I think that the storage will charge and discharge how you need it to do whatever you need it to do. But yes, I agree. Anytime you're charging, it's going to be a cost. So,
but the only thing I would point out, right, the ancillary market will be charging and discharging throughout that operation, right? So how those reports would look on an hourly basis, that's something we'll have to look into, right?
Right, and that's not why I'm not advocating that in the filed report that would be overwhelming. I think
there's a lot. There would be a lot of detail there, right? So
yeah,
exactly what that would look like. We'll have to look at that.
Okay, sorry, I had jumped ahead to reliability. Are we ready to go there now?
Which line are you on?
14, our old
14.
line 14. And as I had said, the metric previously was SAIDI and SAFE. Comment by RAP was SAIDI and SAFE by feeder plus KD by feeder, and I don't see that utilities had a comment.
Your Honor, my engineer did give me a. I think this kind of gets to the next line, which is 15, which gets to the power quality.
Yeah, we're going to get there.
Right. I think he wanted to. I think he basically was saying anything. I think there's things called MAFI, SARF. So there's MAFI, SARFI, the THD, the TDD, basically anything in COMAR that we are required to track. He would want to see that here. Now, maybe some of those are more related to resiliency than reliability. So whether they fall under line 14 or 15, but I think basically anything in that alphabet soup that we can track, he was looking for.
Okay, what I was looking for now is whether the utilities are in agreement that the metric for reliability line 14 should be SAIDI, SAFE by feeder, and KD by feeder. Before we get to anything else, with just line 14.
Can I ask the utilities one question? MAFI and SEMI, are those more resiliency metrics, which we would discuss in line 15, or would those be more reliability metrics?
And just as a side, we'll discuss resilience on the next tab.
Yes. If the utilities know. I'm sorry, I'm a little out of my depth on that one, but.
Deferring to Luke Asmeyer's or Stacy, I don't know if you have any comment. You're safe, SAIDI, SAFE, and KD are available by feeder, as I understand it.
Okay, great. So then,
yes, that's correct.
All right. So 15, service quality, is where staff recommended SARFI 70, and where the utilities have pushed back and said it'll cost $30,000 for metering equipment per site. Who wants to talk about why it will cost $30,000 for metering equipment per site to record SARFI?
Your Honor, this is Luke Hasmeyer with BGE. That is a very rough estimate, and essentially it is reflective of the fact we do not typically install metering at a location that is capable of collecting this data. So this would be additional metering we would have to add to the projects. There are some options that we already have in our assets that we could use for this. Typically, we install them on a temporary basis in response to customer complaints to try and resolve those complaints. We could install them on a permanent basis to collect the information here, but again, that is not a traditional installation for us.
Okay, I'm not sure what staff's going to recommend at this point because I'm assuming what you're saying, there's a $30,000 charge. It's not already in your cost benefit analysis, not that it's significant, but I don't know that staff wants to go out on a limb and say that they should spend this additional money.
I can't state, I haven't talked with my management to say we're definitely going to demand that those be installed, but I think we want this tracked, and my engineers have pushed hard, basically indicating that they do believe that this metric and a couple other metrics really should be tracked. A possible, I think another one related to this is MAFI, which is momentary outages, which is something the utilities are supposed to be setting up in their systems based off of past rulemaking if they aren't already tracking it. But I think really where we're going is, and I think we would like to understand from the utilities is the PUA, one of our main tracking metrics is that we need to be able to report when this is all said and done, whether the project altered the quality or availability of electricity supply, and staff is looking at that quality of that quality language and saying you need this information to be able to make that judgment. And so I guess our question back to the utilities is how do you plan to, if we don't track this information, how are we planning on providing that, I guess, evaluation back to the legislature in a couple years? So I guess we don't want to be installing these willy-nilly across the system, but I think that likely we will be looking for at least some of this to be installed and tracked.
Okay. Sorry to pick on you, Mr. Cleaver, but staff counsel isn't on the line. What's your thought? My understanding, and this is sort of a procedural question, the projects have been preliminarily approved, pending final approval on or before April 15. Our report, I guess, in part might inform that final approval. This would maybe be a decision for the commission. Is there the ability within the case for the commission to review this particular item? Or what do you see happening?
Within the commission's discretion. Well, as I was listening to the discussion, I mean, you know, as we talked about at the last meeting, the service quality reporting is in the statute. I mean, what are the utilities proposing? I mean, it's entirely different than what staff had in mind. What is that? I mean, how would the utilities propose to measure service quality, considering that it's something that's, you know, included within the statute?
So just a question back to you guys. Staff specifically, how was staff going to measure this? I mean, so Luke has identified the possibility of putting in specialized metering equipment at each battery site. Did you have a vision that was different than that potential?
I mean, neither PSC nor its consultant has really, you know, this isn't something that we've focused on. You know, to be frank, I had never heard of Starfeed before the last meeting, and you know, we saw the follow-up materials from staff, and we appreciate that. We haven't really taken a position on this, but it, you know, as like I said, it is within the statute that there does need to be some reporting on service quality, and I think it's a fair question to ask. How, you know, how do you propose to quantify impacts on service quality? Or, you know, regardless of staff's, you know, various suggestions that we've heard about.
Right. Yeah, I was just thinking that you might have had an alternative suggestion other than the one Luke had developed, right?
Are you asking how we're going to baseline it, I guess, in terms of how are we going to, is there a different way? Are you asking if we had a vision for how you would collect the data? Is that what you're asking?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So I will need to ask my engineers on that because obviously I am not one of them, but I think that they were, I think we will likely need to install something, but I think there's a number of these metrics that they also believe you are already capable of tracking. And so I think maybe there needs to be some education between staff and the utilities on this to make sure we all are agreeing what you can do today and what you can't do today. And so, but I think engineering's thought was we would get something on the system for you to start be able to basically measure the baseline data starting now, or we could discuss having, I guess, control feeders. I'm not a fan of that, knowing that this is $30,000 a system to put in. So trying to get enough control feeders would probably become cost prohibitive. But we could discuss that. But I think we would need to basically get metering. We need to get something on. If you say you can't do it today, then I think we need to get something on the system to do it. I think staff use it as it's been tracked before, so we aren't sure. So based off, it sounds like basically just don't typically put this infrastructure in is the barrier. And so, but I think as the engineers have discussed this, they've basically they believe this power quality is necessary for us to do what the General Assembly's asked us to do. So I think if there's a way to do it without installing new equipment, we're all ears. I think we'd need to come up with a solution for the power quality metric that we have to report in 2026. So I know that's a ways off, but I think it's to your point, if we have to install equipment to do it, it's good to know that now, and then we need to make that value call if that's the right way to go about it. But I think the metrics they were thinking were SARFI, this total, sorry, let me spell the acronym. Total harmonic distortion, which is that THD, total demand distortion, which was TDD, and then this metric of MAFI, which is a momentary outage, which maybe that could act. I would when I was talking with the engineers, the engineer, I was saying maybe that since that's tracking momentary outages, maybe that kind of can get to this power quality question. But those are the various metrics I was given to track. And so, and I think that's how we're thinking of getting towards that power quality. We're all ears if other parties have different ways of getting there, but the more they've looked at it, the more they think that this is probably the right way to go. So I guess if you have other solutions for us to do power quality, all ears, I guess.
Yeah, I'll speak. This is Justin. We really crunched a lot of numbers and looked at a lot of things. We don't have a proposal to bring to the table today. So this might be a continuing discussion. There may be a third way here, but we weren't able to come up with one before this working group.
Yeah, other than what Luke had identified as a potential monitor, at the point of interconnection, right, where the bus is connecting to the system, right?
Correct, which we can implement. We just wanted the working group to realize the cost.
There's a cost ramification in exactly what that data brings you back, right?
I agree. And maybe Steve, maybe we can get DeAndre and Luke on the phone together. And maybe this is something where the engineers just need to come to agreement on how best to get at this information. Because, sorry, I just don't know. I'm not qualified. I just don't know how to get at it outside of my engineers. So I would need them to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. But if they talk, maybe they can come up with a better solution, or maybe everyone agrees this is the only approach.
So is that a call that you would set up in the next week or so?
Yeah, I can send you send out an email to get that going.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I will point out, though, as Ben mentioned, this is something that gets reported in 2026. So there's actually some time, I assume, Luke, that the meters can be installed after the project's going to service, right? They can be installed at a later time.
The meter, short of some of the initial setup things, the meters can be installed whenever. We are anticipating trying to install it as the project goes in. The big challenge we had previously identified, and I think it's in the comments, is how do we baseline this? And I think Ben had some comments previously on that. So, but yes, we have the opportunity to install both the meters at the project locations, and then we could install meters elsewhere in the system, you know, as needed after that, or between now and 2026.
Okay. I mean, it would be great if the working group would have a recommendation as part of its March 31st submission, but it does seem as though, compared to some of the other items, there's a little bit of time.
Yeah.
Until the,
Sorry. Yes, Your Honor, I agree with you. I think the one thing is if we need to establish, I think the utilities did raise a good point, which is we need baseline data. And so that's something we need to
so the
figure
meters would
out how
have to
that
go in.
works.
The meters would have to go in by the time the project's in service before February of 2022.
Possibly, or we would just need to think of a different approach.
Right.
But
Can I just have a question for you, the engineers to consider when you meet is, I mean, since these batteries aren't discharging and charging all the time, can you normalize a baseline in the other hours? You may not be able to because of how they're used, but you know, you tell us.
I think that's an excellent point, and I certainly would see if we couldn't use that as a potential metric to do that for a baseline.
Okay. The next line item was a staff comment, I think, on customer willingness to pay. This was previously a non-financially quantifiable metric. I think we're trying to make it a quantifiable metric. The utilities said that Delmarva at least will track willingness to pay at Elk Neck, CapEx, OPEX. But are we getting to, as the percentage, but are we getting to dollars?
So the thought there was that we would track this through market research, right? That would give us an indication of what customers would be willing to pay for the installation of a behind the meter residential battery system, right? So that would gauge potentially the market receptivity based on the experience that customers have out of the batteries and kind of what their willingness to pay going forward for battery systems. And we thought we could gauge it that way. That's more of a question really for the residential consumers, we think at this point. But, you know, there were some other calculations, CapEx, but this is to me a kind of a market research question related to that item.
But a market research question that can get to $1. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it can get to, I mean, we can certainly get to probably a range of $1. You know, would you be willing to pay, X dollars for the installation of a battery system having, and there'll be different points, right? You'll have some experience where you've avoided X number of outages as a result of the battery, and that will give you a sense of what it might be worth to you financially to be able to make an investment in the future. That's kind of what our thought was on that. So that would help then gauge kind of what the market penetration might be if this were a service that you could purchase and for a fee out into the future, right?
Okay, Ben?
I just wanted to validate with Steve. When you say market research, is this just is this surveys to the customers after they've used the battery?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, if you think about it, 110 residential accounts will receive batteries. From that, we'll get a lot of information about whether customers found those batteries to be valuable, and if so, what dollar value they might place on a willingness to purchase a battery system like that in the future. So they'll have had direct experience with it, and we'll get a sense of whether or not they think that that's a good financial investment to make.
I would just also note, maybe to supplement your market research with a literature review. I know there's several pilot projects that have customers contributing to the cost of the systems, in Vermont in particular. I'm familiar with a program there.
Right, there's some in Vermont, New Hampshire, and a couple other spots. But would that be part of the reporting, right? So the reporting would really focus on the projects that we're delivering here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So are you thinking of additional reporting beyond that?
No, well, I was just thinking it would be interesting to compare what you're finding in your market research to what other programs. Maybe that would
Yeah,
be reporting outside of this formal
yeah.
process. But
The only caution there is in Vermont, New Hampshire, they would be accounts that actually paid in and elected to have those batteries put in place. In this case, since we wanted to cover all different types of income groups and customer characteristics, right, we're giving the batteries at no charge to those that choose to participate. So if you want to, it depends on how you think of that, right? So if you've already indicated a willingness to pay and an ability to afford a battery system in Vermont and New Hampshire, this is a little bit different in that we are taking all those who elect to participate when we reach out to them, right? So a little bit of a different characteristic. So I just kind of be mindful of the different demographics that we're getting here.
no, that's a good point. There's a self-selection bias in those willingness.
Yeah, and kind of income and wealth biased, right? So, you know, customers of different income and wealth tiers are going to be willing to pay more or less depending on their kind of personal use of those battery systems.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to move on just because we're running short on time too. Was there something else on that? The joint utilities response to the islanding, avoiding lost load comment was that they will track for the Elk Neck virtual power plant the number of minutes participating residential customers rely on battery storage during grid outages, and more importantly, well, not more importantly, but I was going to talk about the Ocean City project, the number of minutes that the Ocean City project provides energy to the adjacent public library. I guess that would seem to fall under H7 Romanet I-42 societal benefits. I think we had previously said societal benefits were things like low to moderate income and seniors and schools, but I would think libraries gets pretty close. But is there no dollar value?
Well, so yeah, so how would we evaluate the dollar value there? I mean, we could use the outage cost estimates, but in Ocean City, for example, if we connect to the public library, which we're still working on, if that's used as a center for resiliency, not quite clear how we assign a dollar value to that. For Elk Neck, we could assign a dollar value based on outage costs avoided. But again, for the Elk Neck battery, it's going to connect to certain end uses. It won't connect to all end uses. So you're not going to have full capability within your home, but you're going to have capability to have lights and maybe a computer, refrigeration, and that type of thing. You won't have everything you would otherwise normally have when you're grid connected. So just need to think about how you might figure that one.
Models of the values people place on having certain items.
There might be, but the one that's been accepted in Maryland is the DOE. What is the DOE model? Yeah. And so I don't know whether it has additional granularity. And Tom, do you know whether that has additional granularity on end uses? I don't know the answer to that. We could check.
It might. I thought it actually did, but I could be wrong.
I just haven't studied it enough to know the answer, but we can study that question.
Okay, because what I'm kind of coming up against is we were sort of given the direction to, if you read the order, financially quantify or at least quantify anything that we previously said was not quantifiable.
Right. So we will be able to quantify the number of minutes that this has provided some level of service during grid outages for each of these projects that we've listed: Elk Neck, Ocean City, and the electric bus depot. The dollar value of that is a little bit more challenging, right? Very challenging for the Ocean City project because that's more of a, you know, a community-based kind of resource at the time of grid outages. The electric bus depot will allow the buses to continue to be charged during that grid outage event, so it'll support that, but it's supporting it through a microgrid structure, right? And then the Elk Neck, the question of individual end uses. So we can look a little bit more closely, but again, some of those dollar values are going to be difficult to develop.
Okay, I guess at least number of minutes helps to quantify, which is what our major direction was. Dollars would be
great, but a little bit more challenging. Yes.
Okay, I think that at least I understand I'm sorry.
Does Potomac Edison have an opinion on this? Because I know one, if not both, of their projects one of them I think acts as a microgrid, and the other, the one that they just proposed, I think has the possibility of operating as an island for EV charging, similar to the bus depot. So I guess I was just curious to know if they had any anything else to add to this, because I think both of their projects do kind of lean towards islanding.
And I thought they were on the call.
Yeah, this is Brian Molenchat. No, I don't really have anything to add. I guess, you know, for our Town Hill project, the ability for it to island is really the basis for the project, right? There's a outage situation occurs and the battery would then pick up those customers that were islanded really as a result of the outage. So, you know, the value for resiliency in that aspect is really the value that we've, you know, quantified as the benefits. I think it's kind of closely aligned to that. For the EV charging, no, we were not able to really put anything, you know, good faith wise as far as estimating the resiliency of being able to charge, you know, electric vehicles during a system-wide outage.
Okay, thanks. So, you know, I agree with Steve that this will be a hard one to throw a dollar value at, though I think there are some studies out there that we can reference if we want to try.
Okay, for future work, yes.
Yeah.
I think I understand, and I don't think we need further discussion on unintentional, the islanding, the utilities will track it if it happens to take place, because it would be bad. Avoided gas generation, minutes and kilowatt hours of gas generation displaced by storage. Staff, any comment here? Are we good?
I think that makes sense. So you'll basically, when you're giving them the storage, ask them, did you have a backup gas generator? You'll just ask them some questions about it at that time.
Yeah, so the idea is when we go out and recruit customers, we'll track whether they have backup generation, and if so, what those characteristics are. And so then presumably during an outage event, some level of that gas generation is avoided. I'm not sure whether all of it would be avoided, but some level of that would be avoided for that homeowner.
So again, we have at least minutes or kilowatt hours.
We would. And again, remember that our batteries, because of their size, are likely to be connected to kind of core end uses, lighting, you know, television or computer or plug loads, and refrigeration, right? They're not likely to be connected to HVAC.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense. Your Honor, just for, I think, back on the islanding, I just something for you and others to think about is I do know Empower has a comfort benefit that we give out.
True.
I don't know if it will translate as well to islanding, but maybe it's something. So just, we can all noodle on that one.
Certainly worth looking at. Yep.
We already handled analysis of funds generated from wholesale market, and we also last meeting handled our discussion of capital costs and O&M. So I think we're going over to tab 2, see how far we can get. NOx emissions reductions. I have, does Empower have? Are we? Because again, we're referring back to the utilities February 1 compliance filing. And I think I just had a question of whether Empower has what we need there. Is that Justin?
Yeah, so Empower doesn't have a NOx value right now, right? And so that was the thing that we were missing in terms of valuation. And David, I thought you were going to think a little bit about the NOx valuation as well, right? We just didn't have a dollar value for that at this point.
Yeah, there are NOx market values, and the question is whether we want to pick those up or not here for purposes of trying to value it, or whether we want to use a pound figure.
Dave, have those non-market values been used in other evaluations throughout? Like, are they recent numbers that people have relied on in evaluations?
Yeah, they are market values because NOx offsets can be estimated. They may or may not. And if Kathleen is on, she would know this better than I would, is what they're trading for. But those market values are simply what a NOx offset is going for. And a NOx offset is something that has to be bought to expand facilities within a restricted region called the ozone transport region. They're not representative at all of the public health impacts and other things that we were talking about on the other tab. They're just, simply as the regulatory construct for under the Clean Air Act for that. So the question is it important to the group for us to work with the joint utilities and all of you to estimate the range of those and try to quantify that? I'm asking because for utility commissions and commissioners, I'd have to give more background than this to bring them up to speed. And it's usually not that, the NOx value isn't that important to them. The public health piece might be. And so if you want us to dig into that, to come up with market valuations, we can. The utilities has asked the further question, well, if we're going to do that, shouldn't we update those because those change over time? That, and so I'll stop there without giving more detail and questions.
And yeah, hey Dave, just a question for you. The original estimate, there wasn't an estimate in the original Empower work for NOx, and it must be because the valuation was so low or so speculative at the time for NOx. And the question to you is, do you think that there's a ready source for that dollar value, and do you think it would be material to the evaluation of the pilots?
Well, again, back to, this is the prior point we made on the public health model. These emissions are going to be, these are very, 5 or 6 pilots that are small. So measuring the avoided NOx, which would presumably come from natural gas generation, it may work out according to some of the things we've seen. It may be a mixed picture. Some of it may be additional NOx. Some of it may be avoided NOx, depending on when they discharge on and off peak and what units are on the margin. So it's a complicated calculation. So my thinking would be to try to keep it in pounds of NOx, and that does quantify it, but avoids and it would be pounds avoided or pounds generated. That even might be subject of, I think, Steve, what you were asking me about is that too complicated for us to get into here? I do think if we do get granular hourly marginal figures from PJM for the zone, we may have to adjust them to apply to the zone, that we probably could do that calculation.
So, hey, Ed, you're on still, right?
Yeah.
You want to jump in?
Yeah. I guess my only comment is sort of if you look at the emission rates for like CO2 versus NOx, you're talking orders of magnitude difference. And if you look at our numbers in our filing, you're seeing 10 pounds, 12 pounds, 30 pounds versus, hundreds of 1,000 pounds on CO2. So I think you could propose, a value to that, but I think it's going to be such a small number. I just don't know if it has value or not.
Okay. At least we have pounds. Land use, it sounds as though the utilities will come up with acreages if there is avoided land use greater than a quarter acre. Is that right, Justin?
Yeah, that's Steve. Yeah, that's what we proposed, right?
Arguably, you could put a dollar value to that, but maybe not necessary.
And so, yeah, David, you were looking at the land use valuation method. So we'd be able to track avoided use of land for utility purposes. Things like an avoided feeder line, or things like an avoided or deferred substation. But beyond that, the dollar value of that land avoided, you were going to take a look at that, right?
Yeah, and I'll speak to that. I would be very interested in trying to do that calculation, and I know that there are some commissioners that are interested in that on the Maryland Commission. But I'm not recommending that here because to do it right, we need to get into figuring out which you have to make some assumptions. Are you talking about avoided solar? And if you're talking about avoided solar, is it solar within the zone, or if so is the zone constrained or not? You know, we may need to get into that. Some of you know that because I've been asking you those questions, to which I have gathered I'm able to ask the question, and people right now are able to say that's a good question. But I mean, and if you're in an import constrained zone, then what would matter is what resources on the margin in the zone. If you're not, you know, the system, at least the PJME system, arguably is what should be used to actually figure out what energy you're avoiding and what additional solar may or may not be generated. It seems awfully complicated to try to arrive at a figure that's going to be very small here, if measurable at all.
Hey, so David, you jumped to the next one, right? So we were talking about,
I thought you were talking about avoided land.
Yeah. Did you have a thought in terms of valuing that avoided land, right? So the value of land in the Washington metro area is high, right? And you get into a more rural location, it's a lower value. Did you give any consideration how to put a dollar value on that?
I mean, we could do. You have to know what type of land it is, but one could one could find average land values. I wasn't looking into that, but I know you can find that. And I'm sorry.
Right, and it's avoided land for a period of time, right? So if we defer a substation, that doesn't mean the substation doesn't eventually get built, but for a period of time, that land is now remaining as open space or for some other use, right, in that interim period. So it's a time and an availability of that land for another purpose, right?
Yes.
All right. So
Steve, wouldn't the utilities be in possession of the information as far as where the land is?
We will. We'll have the information about the location, and we'll have the information about the element that's avoided. Substation will avoid actual land use for that purpose for a period of time, right, for a deferral. So we'll have that. We'll know where it's located, and then the question for you, David, or for anyone else, is exactly how to put a dollar value on that. That's all.
Does this go both ways? So I know so if you're avoiding a distribution upgrade, obviously it'd probably avoid more land than take up with a battery, but we do have some batteries that we're installing that aren't avoiding anything. So would this be a two-way calculation?
Well, clarify what you mean by two-way calculation.
So sorry, I mean, so would we also count the land that storage is taking up against itself as well?
We can certainly do that. I don't know whether it's going to be greater than or lower than a quarter acre. We'll have to run the calculation.
Yeah, I don't.
Sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
But
And isn't the land or any land associated with the battery project incorporated in the cost portion?
Yes,
if you had to purchase it.
Yes, Your Honor, it is. If there is one, it is included. But the fact is, the bus depot, you know, what we pay, we are assuming the vendor or the bidder has to factor that into the quote they gave us.
Yeah, the only hesitancy in my comment there, Tom, is that a lot of the land where we're putting these batteries is existing utility-owned property, right?
Yeah.
So the batteries are being placed on, for example, in Ocean City, it's going to be placed on a utility-owned parking lot, right? So we own the parking lot, and so if we don't use it for the battery, it'll be used for some other purpose until it's used for some other utility purpose, right? So it has a value, and the only question is thinking about how that value is. At National Harbor, again, it's utility-owned property. And if that property isn't used for the battery right away, it's open space for a period of time until something else is put there, right?
I'm gonna jump in here. I guess my thought on land use was not utility owned, that if you're not using your own land, that doesn't really provide the same value as if you didn't have to take other land that wasn't already utility owned. That could be open space or park or.
But remember that if it's utility owned land, right, it's open space until it has something placed there. So does that have dollar value? Presumably it has some level of dollar value. I mean, if you look at the National Harbor site, there's an adjacent baseball field that seems to be partially on utility-owned land. So, it's being used for another purpose. So I'm just saying, how do you think of that? Right.
Judge Lawrence,
Yeah, it's different from taking land, though.
I just want to clarify, Judge Lawrence, 1 second. I think the way when I looked at the cost modeling, I looked at incremental cost. In the case of National Harbor, where we already had the land, we have already paid for it. So I did not factor that directly because it was already spent, and we are looking at incremental costs. So I stand corrected if I had added some confusion into what I said.
No, I was just saying that when we originally talked about this as a working group, my thought of the value of land is the not utilities land. If they don't use it, has some value. It would be land that they didn't have to acquire for another type of generation that took away from that land out of its other use, because it was owned by someone else and could have been used for something else.
At least on the PHI side, and again, BG guys jump in, but none of our projects require the acquisition of additional land, right, for the battery. And they do avoid, in some cases, additional distribution equipment placement, right? So a feeder line or an additional substation.
Which would require acquisition of land.
Which would require or repurposing of existing utility-owned property, right?
I just don't see as much of a value in the existing utility as opposed to.
Nonetheless, it is open space
If you think of it as a, excuse me, Judge Lawrence, if you think of it as a societal benefit, then it's a change in land use, which may have an impact in terms of societal value of that space. But I don't know whether that's relevant in this particular case, but I do see the two issues of acquiring new land at a cost versus changing land use based on existing property that's owned by the utility.
David Littell, how far of a rabbit trail are we following right now in terms of real value to these projects?
I realize substation land can be very valuable when you don't have enough of it. As in Brooklyn and the Brooklyn Queens project, right? It was so valuable that they spent billions of dollars trying to avoid expanding a substation. So, or $1 billion anyway. So, so I don't mean to diminish it, but I was not at the case conference on this in front of the commission, so I may have a misimpression, but in other matters I've been involved in with the commission, I think what I know is that this issue comes up and like how much solar build out can we avoid? How much, farmland, can this and that? So I could be wrong. Someone correct me if that's wrong, but that's why I immediately jumped to the next issue. So I'll put that aside, but I'm not sure.
Well, we didn't talk about it in front of the commission, so that's, I guess, good. But I see where you're going with the. I guess I divided in half with the. I think the solar's next. In terms of the value of that land, it just feels like we're getting into a second derivative impact, because I could see it going either way. You decrease people's home values around this. I always thought of it as maybe you're either using land that had no value around it, or maybe you're decreasing property values, maybe you're increasing them. I don't know. But I guess thinking about all of that, I never really thought about, well, maybe we would be trying to avoid building in a downtown New York. Obviously, we wouldn't do that here, but maybe there is some. I guess that is a good question. But if the utilities already own the land, I guess, yeah, it does. I'm just wondering how much more that diminishes the cost impacts that we're talking about, maybe just for these 6 projects. But
so the only thing I'd add to that cost question, the land is already there for each of these projects. For the residential Elk Neck, it's going to be behind the meter, right? So it's on residential property. For the electric bus depot, it's an existing bus transit facility in Montgomery County. That'll have a battery placed on that land. So there's really not a change in the land use there, but in other cases, it's avoided use of the land for utility infrastructure. So it depends on how you want to think about it. But we can certainly track what's avoided and when it exceeds 1/4 of an acre or equals 1/4 of an acre, we can track that, report that out, and then decide whether or not we want to put a dollar value on it.
Yeah, I think that's the best we're gonna be able to do for now.
Just point of information that the Chesapeake project will be on new land, will be third party owned and leased land. So that, but it's also avoiding a undergrounding project, which may, have some other land impacts.
And Justin,
incorporate them.
the cost of using that land, not talking about the secondary effects of the value of that land, but the cost of using that land is already built in your cost estimates or your contract price, correct?
That's correct.
Do you have?
We're not leasing it. It's all handled by the third party and baked into the service fee we pay them.
If you were to need to do the undergrounding project, would you have to acquire a new right of way, or would it be on existing right of way?
I don't have that answer in front of me. I don't know if Luke or Stacy would have that. I imagine it's undergrounding of existing land that we'd have right away, but I can't answer with certainty.
Okay. Yeah, the answer might, if it's not that it may be more significant than we're assuming here. Right.
This is Luke Hasmeyer with BGE. This would be new right of way. We do not have existing underground rights through most of that area, which is one of the problems with that project.
Oh, well, maybe we should focus on that project to develop an estimate, because new right-of-way acquisition is both an administrative cost as well as, you might have opposition, you might have to use eminent domain. That might be substantial. So that might be worth measuring, but that's project specific. What do you all think?
I'm fine looking at. I'm people want to look into it. I would entertain it.
Yeah.
Is that BG&E? It would be you'd have to do it with us. So is it worth the effort for us? We can make assumptions, obviously. We don't have to go out and look at each parcel, but is that something you want to do?
Not speaking maybe just from me, but the this wasn't a value stream we highlighted or even put in our filing. It's not something we're looking to track necessarily. And I think the other value streams and things we're putting on are very substantive. This is not something I see as extremely important, but if the stakeholders do see an importance to it, we'll be responsive.
I think if we track the acreage, we can all make certain assumptions from there. And if the utilities haven't already had it in their estimates and their cost benefit analysis, I don't think we need to add it, other than to note that it's possible. That's for purposes of the working group recommendations, it's possible to come up with a dollar value here, but we'll at least have acreage. Moving on to distributed generation hosting capacity, I think we get a delta hosting capacity shown on subsequent maps. So that's our quantification. Anybody correct me if I'm wrong there? And I'd like to jump ahead to line 10, resilience. Steve, back in the day, we talked about your thoughts about resilience with respect to grid resilience, major outage restoration type data.
So just for clarity on the resilience measurement, what we were thinking about is that's a different measurement than outages, right? And so there was a proposal.
Well, let me stop you right there.
Yeah, go ahead.
The way I view resilience is there's really two categories of resilience. There's what I thought you had talked about previously, which is grid resilience from the point of view of the utilities and having to do with how quickly you can get your everything back up and running after a major outage. Then there's customer resilience and the things we kind of touched on before with the islanding and the value to customers of being able to still have power or to get back up and have power when there's a major outage. So
right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So one of them is an outage cost calculator, and we have been able to do that with the LBNL tool that we've used in the past in Maryland. So that's an outage cost estimate, avoided outage cost. The other one is resiliency, and that's the ability to restore your system during a major grid outage and what the value of that is. And it's the latter item that we have never reached a consensus in Maryland or any other jurisdiction how to define the value of resiliency. And one of the stakeholders had suggested that we kind of explore how to value resiliency. And so that was kind of a reaction. We can certainly study the issue further, see if there's consensus, but I think it will be very difficult for us to reach consensus on that, given particularly that none of the national laboratories have actually reached consensus on how to measure and value resiliency per se. I know that one of the Maryland commissioners did ask us about that in a microgrid hearing that we had. We didn't have a good answer to that, but then we don't know that there really is a good answer to the value of that restoration capability for resiliency.
Okay, but both of the two items you mentioned, the outage cost calculator and the ability to restore your system, again, relate to grid resilience, correct? Did you take a look at RAP's comments, which really go to customer resilience in the spreadsheet on line 10?
Yeah, I mean, so we can measure outage costs and that recovery, but in terms of how you're defining resiliency for a customer, we need clarity on that.
Well, isn't it the customer's ability to have a battery when there's during a major outage?
Yeah, for me, that's an outage cost calculation, and we can certainly make that calculation. It's the recovery piece of it, and so that's an outage cost. The other one is a resiliency measurement, so that's a little bit confusing in terms of the terminology there.
David Littell, were you thinking we would track of the value of the avoided outage, basically if we're able to define resiliency as the in the time avoided by basically having these batteries there, does that just become the value of the avoided outage to the customer kind of a calculation, or are you thinking something different?
Yeah, no, I hear what Steve is saying. And I think we should do the outage calculation, but that's from the point of view of, well, of what the outage costs. What I would submit is it's very hard to put a financial value on it, but that we track the minutes and the use for those projects that can actually island and provide customer value behind the meter or operations. So the Elk Neck projects may be whatever those circuits are hooked up to, it refrigeration, some lights, some cell phone charging. Those are the types of things I would expect. You'd put a limited circuit on. The bus depot project, that would be additional charging, or if they're using it for basic functionality of the system, to measure exactly what's being enhanced there and not being enhanced there. That's the resilience, what you can do when the grid is down. And simply to try to measure that in minutes and function is our proposal, because it's too hard to value that.
Right. So David, yeah, that's really an outage cost avoidance, right? Calculation. And we can certainly use parts of the LB&L calculator for residential. A little bit harder in the bus depot example, right? Because that's basically electric transit buses continuing to operate. So we can certainly track the minutes. That's a bit different than what I would label as resiliency, right? So that's the ability to recover. So as we think of that.
Again, this is, I think, Judge Lawrence's comment, and to reinforce it, resiliency has several characteristics, and when you're grid resiliency, the ability to recover, as you put it, is certainly a measure of resiliency, but there's also customer resiliency, and that's the ability to operate or continue to function during an outage. And so I want to measure both here.
Okay, so we can certainly track the time and the outage costs, but the additional value then of your definition of resiliency for the individual customer, a little bit hard to drive to, right? Unless there's an agreement that any of us could have in terms of how to calculate that.
Yeah, not proposing a financial value, just to track the minutes and the use,
right,
which is going to vary depending on the installation.
Okay, so we will be tracking that for that islanding discussion earlier too.
Right. And I would just direct perhaps council to number 42 under H7 Romanet I or 7H Romanet I. You are to report on other identified benefits, including resiliency and societal benefits. So I'm not sure that, Steve, your definition of resiliency really fits there. I think it's really what RAP is talking about and the customer's viewpoint of resiliency. That would be my interpretation of how that's the phrase, in that section. Again,
Okay.
maybe that's not to you, that's to your council, but you're going to have to report on it, so you might want to think about it.
Right. Okay. So we'll think about that. We are tracking the minutes of avoided outage. We are tracking the minutes of islanding. Right. So we are tracking those elements as well. So we're tracking both pieces of it. And, in terms of the dollar value, we simply don't have a dollar value for resiliency, right? So per that discussion.
But per our earlier discussion about islanding, we were getting close to dollar values, if you recall. So I'm not sure why we're not close to them here.
Yeah, I mean, so we have a value for outage costs. We don't have a value for what we're talking about is an added value for resiliency. That's the only thing there.
But you're going to look at things like the DOE model.
Yeah, the LB&L model for outage costs, right? See if it has any additional granularity related to end uses, or whether we just have to use the model more generally in terms of those outage cost estimates. Yeah.
Are you referring to the ICE model, the value of lost load?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah,
don't
that's
believe it
because
does by end use. It does residential and commercial, but not as far as I know.
Yeah, right. That's my sense as well. But we need to look at the detail on that to see if there's any additional information we can glean from that.
Okay.
And a little bit difficult. For example, the electric bus transit. The electric bus transit operation is going to continue during outage events because they're going to be able to charge the buses and not interrupt their schedule. That has value, but exactly how to calculate that value is going to be difficult.
Okay, those were the items that I felt were most important to cover. There's a few I skipped over. Is there, at this point, I guess I'll turn it over to staff if there's anything they want to talk about based on the utilities filing.
Yeah, just give me 1 minute.
Sure.
So on number 4 on the same tab, electric vehicle transportation, Pepco will provide annual updates to the number of electric buses recharged at the electric bus depot. My question was, is Pepco also, I know last time we discussed this, there was a discussion about avoided emissions. Are you still looking to try and do that, or are you not worrying about that anymore?
Yeah, we had discussed that quite a bit on how to value that, because what we're essentially avoiding is diesel or natural gas fueled buses in Montgomery County. So we can certainly track the number of buses, but running those other calculations, question of whether you'd want us to do that or not, and if so, what the calculation might be.
Okay, but it wasn't something your team was still thinking about doing at this time unless somebody pushed you on it?
Right, that's our current thought. Yeah. And if you guys want to go that far, we can certainly do it. We just need to agree on how to run that calculation, right?
Okay, I don't know or think we would go there, but I'll take it back. I just wanted to know where we were.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of a number of ways to value that, but we can certainly track the number of electric buses located at that transit facility, right, for charging purposes.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I had a question on that point, and the utility comment was the tracking the number of electric buses that are charged. I'm curious, is this charging from the battery system itself during?
Yeah, so the way this is set up at the electric transit bus depot is it's a microgrid structure, right? So there'll be a PV array at the site, and then there'll be batteries at the site to balance the loads, and then there'll be a gas generator at the location as well. So during a grid interruption, the electric bus transit facility is going to be able to continue in operation as it normally would, assuming all of the components are working. That adds a level of reliability to the use of electric transit buses. And through the use of the microgrid, they'll avoid additional demands on the electric distribution system by properly managing loads at that facility.
Yep.
So whether the battery charges an electric bus at any particular point in time, it kind of depends on the relative loads at the site, right?
I guess I would characterize it less on the number of buses, but the number of charging events in the energy delivered.
Yeah, we can see whether we can easily, I was looking for information that we could easily get from the county government. That we can certainly get the number of electric transit buses that are based at that location. How much additional information we can get, we'll have to talk with the county government about that. Yeah.
Okay.
And then sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if you want us to do that, we can go ahead and pursue that.
All right. I just want to make sure you're not talking past each other here. Steve, were you intending to try to limit it just to the charging events that occur? And actually, the Steve, sorry. Yeah, or would the bus depot itself become unfunctional in a power outage, regardless of the backup? So are we going to count everything, or does the natural gas backup allow it to continue to function?
The three components of the microgrid will allow that continued operation. You know, each one is critical to the microgrid, right? So the load balancing that the batteries can offer, PV array that'll be used to largely charge the batteries, and then the gas generator to basically sustain kind of constant load. So you could argue which is the most important. I would suggest to you that batteries are a critical part of that microgrid operation. But for the batteries, there would be other issues with managing the load at that site. So it's kind of used as load balancing. You know, could argue about which is actually deriving the support for the electric transit buses, but I would argue batteries are a critical component of meeting that load obligation, particularly in an outage situation as well, right?
So it sounds like you're gonna count all the electrical buses that are charged during an outage towards the reductions, and I don't have an issue with that. It just seemed to be different than what Synapse might be thinking. So I want to make sure we got a meeting of the minds here.
Yeah, what we've proposed is to report out the number of electric transit buses based at that location, right? And so that's our proposal, because we know we can get that data from the county government, right?
But can you get more? Because I'm not sure that's terribly helpful.
Well, and we can see what the county is able to share. I can't commit to that until we have that discussion, right?
And Steve, this is because the county owned, this is, just remind me, sorry, I just keeping track of all, this is a county owned battery, correct? So if we want to know how it's being used, they need to save the data and share it with us. Is that correct?
Yeah, and we'll get that information from Alpha Structure. What we won't have is the detailed information about the electric bus operation and the charging schedule. And the county owns the facility. Alpha Structure is going to run the facility for the county. We can see whether we can get additional information related to the hours that the buses charge and the maybe the amount of kilowatt hours they consume and that type of thing. But I'm not sure what granularity we're going to get from them. We do know that we're going to get the number of electric buses that are based at that location. We are going to get that information. And we have a scheduled build out which changes over time related to the additional electric transit buses at that location. So we'll have that information. We know we can get that from the county. What we don't know is how much additional specificity related to charging cycles and bus routes and that type of thing that we can also get.
And this is when you're talking about the granularity, I'm assuming we can get, like, we'll be able to see the charging profiles. We'll be able to see what the storage is doing, but we just might not know if that demand on the storage at that time is bus driven or something else driven. That's the granularity.
Yeah, all of that's true. Although the bulk of the loads here are going to be bus driven, right? So they're all going to be, when they plug those buses in, they're going to use a fair amount of load each time, right, with the transit buses.
Okay, if you can, to follow up, I do think it would be helpful to know if figure out what can be done to know when a bus is plugged in or not. If there's a way that can be verified and shared for the purpose of evaluation, I do agree with Synapse. That would be helpful.
Yeah, we'll see what the county is able to share on that, and we can also talk to Alpha Structure, right? we can do that. Yep.
Another, if people are ready, I had the next one I wanted to ask. So Steve, so the next one has to do with, I believe, economic development. So basically you're going to track your incremental cost by project. I guess I was having a hard time seeing how we then translate that to macroeconomic benefit. I understand that we'll be spending extra money in the state, but I guess trying to think, is that really going to translate to, I guess, additional jobs or whatever most economists look at to say we're creating a macroeconomic benefit?
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on how you think of that, right? One of the DRs that we received is the number of Maryland-based jobs that would be located at each site, and we did provide some prior estimate of that, but here we'll actually have the dollar, a clear metric is the dollar value, the dollars that are spent within the state providing these services. So we'll have that information, and then we hadn't proposed a macroeconomic model or anything there. We had just suggested that we would report out the dollars that are spent. So it depends on how you want to think about that.
Okay. I have to think about how you would, if you could even translate this. I mean, we would be able to say, here's extra money that's being spent in the state, and we can make claims about how that worked. I don't know if how maybe you can only do this for utility owned, but are we able to know incrementally if additional labor had to be added to not build, but to continually operate these things? It would be good to know what labor was needed to build it, obviously, but those are probably existing jobs. But if these are creating sustained, continued jobs, I guess if there's a way to track that, I think that would be interesting to know. Once again, value added versus cost to get. I'm not jumping out on a limb far, but if it's possible.
Yeah, and so the other comment we'd gotten, in the DRs was how much of the labor is based in Maryland. We had some, estimates of that, but that's going to be a little more difficult to track. So we would certainly know the number of jobs for each of the projects, but we'll have to check with our vendors on exactly what they can provide going forward. Okay.
So Steve, you came up with a value for learnings, right?
Yeah, I was waiting for that one, right? Yeah, no, it's worth a lot, right? So we spent a lot of time on this call. So yeah, what's your guidance there?
Your hourly rate? Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, clearly learnings is, the whole reason that we're doing the pilots, right, is the learnings. And so that has the greatest value of all of that, right?
What about Ben, grid services? Did the utility comment answer your question?
Sorry, which number is that one? Oh, 9. I think, not to be blunt, I guess I just did not see what this had to do with the I guess let me rephrase that. I feel like we might be talking past each other on this one. So I'm trying to understand, what were you getting? I think when we were thinking about operational flexibility, it was your ability to, or at least when I read it in the report, was our ability we don't need it at this location anymore, but we need to go over here, and we have a new location that could use the storage. We could uproot the storage, move it, and plop it down. And I don't think that's what you're stating here. So I guess what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so when we thought of operational flexibility, and certainly moving batteries is one potential, but the way these things are structured, they're batteries that are not, at least initially, mobile, that can be moved at some future date. But the idea is, what additional flexibility does it allow the utility control center and distribution operation team to basically handle load requirements on the system? So our thought is that by the number of, say, emergency calls, the number of peak shaving events, that would give an indication of the value that the distribution operation receives as a benefit related to the location of this battery. So when we think about that, it provides more flexibility in meeting load requirements by our control centers. In yours, the idea is that, hey, you can move the battery around in the long run. Certainly true. These are largely going to remain fixed for the bulk of the pilot period, we think. And so they're not really likely to be moved, but really what the greater value there is what the control center is able to do in terms of meeting the load obligation.
And is this a direction received from, so you'll operate how you normally operate it, but if PJM calls you up and says, we need you to get off, we need demand or something, or they call a load event, you can make something disappear. That's what you're thinking?
Yeah, but I'm actually thinking a little bit more granular than that, right? So the distribution operation actually has requirements to meet the load obligation. And this is another tool with our control center. They can actually, rather than rerouting load across another feeder line, they could actually discharge the battery to help meet that load obligation or deal with that constraint or deal with the emergency on the system. And so the thought there is that by recording the number of times and the minutes that the utility uses for that capability is an indication of maybe the value to the distribution system operation in terms of flexible approaches for meeting the loads. And that's kind of the thought there.
I like that better than where we were going, because ours will be a very discrete event that we will all know if it happened or not. So
right, and yeah, moving the batteries just during the length of the pilot's not that likely. Agreed that over the long run, as you get more mobile battery systems, certainly worth thinking about. But really, I just think about the flexibility from the grid operations from the control center, distribution control centers particularly.
Okay, yeah, let me run that by my engineers, but I think we would not have an. I'm going on a limb and saying I don't think we'll have an issue with that.
Okay.
I think my I just had a comment on the impact of pilot. This is on row 19, impacts of pilots of encouraging non-utility participation. I'm not sure what we would really track here for this. I appreciate where you're going with the third-party suppliers. I think that they're bundled inside of that. I feel like it's a little broader, but I also don't know how to improve this metric at all, other than you did some RFPs and people participated. So I don't know if others have views on that, but and then if we're done here, I did have a couple questions on the back on the CO2 stuff that I found after we talked.
Okay, I guess before we go back there, just I guess OPC did have a comment on the grid services. Any further after the explanation given? Are we?
No, that was what Steve described was exactly our thoughts in terms of the grid flexibility tracking, not on the relocation of those assets to different locations. So thank you.
Okay. All right, then back to you, Ben.
Thank you. Let me pull back up. Your point number 10 in your filing, I was trying to wrap my head around that. Are you basically saying that you'll start with the full actual nameplate capacity of the storage, and then you will all these storage projects have a degradation factor, and you'll basically apply that over time until you reach the agreed upon contract rate? Is that what you're stating?
So
it's on page 8 of your filing.
Yes, I'm not. Oh, so this is the April 15th filing that you're referencing, or?
Sorry, no, this is the February 1st filing.
Oh, yes. Oh, okay, yeah.
Hey,
Sorry,
Steve,
I don't have that up. Yeah, okay.
So Ben, so what we were saying is basically for the BGE projects, the way they were modeled, they started out at a higher, there is degradation, and they modeled it and they used that in their projections. For the PHI projects they didn't, so we kept the constant megawatt hour rating. That's the difference.
Okay. And then this is, I think, for Steve. I don't remember reading anything about Elkneck and having to deal with solar photovoltaics. Is this it? Are you basically making this statement in case you give a battery to a customer who has one, and that's when this metric becomes relevant.
So in terms of tracking the PV charging from the battery, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the idea is that when we go out and recruit participants, we're going to recruit different types of participants into the program. Some of those participants may have solar on their rooftops and may elect to connect the battery to the solar array for reliability purposes. And so we'll track all of those details as we recruit customers into the program. Yeah.
And can I ask a quick question? In your estimate of the emissions benefits for that project, did you assume all of the elk neck batteries would be paired with solar?
Yeah, Ed, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, we did not. We put a percentage in the appendix. It was pretty low. Let me pull it up here.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's in the appendix in terms of the what we actually assumed. But I want to say it's
5% is very small number.
But you did find a net reduction in emissions, though, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So we assumed that 5% of the battery usage, that's it's being charged by solar. We would take advantage of that in terms of emission reductions.
Okay.
Yeah, and the actual number of participants and their characteristics will affect that, right? As we look forward, and how they connect the battery, right? So the battery might be standalone, or it might be connected to the PV array.
And it sounds like initially it's going to be used as a demand response resource, given current PJM rules, and there's currently a study underway to evaluate whether they'll pursue the pilot for full VPP participation.
Right. So yeah, multiple questions. So related to PJM market activity, so it'll be used for peak shaving, emergency grid purposes by the utility. In the PJM market, it'll be used in the ancillary market regulation D as a DER resource under the existing PJM rules. And then over time, because of the FERC order 2222, it'll cut over to whatever the market rules are established for aggregated behind the meter assets would look like storage assets. And since we don't know exactly what those will look like, that's kind of a future scenario.
I see.
Yeah, and in the interim, we're also envisioning a PJM pilot that we're working through the mechanics on that'll help PJM staff and us kind of guide that project through that kind of changing landscape as we work forward. Yeah.
And then on the Excel sheet, I just want to validate what you're stating here. At your last sentence is note that the financial value of air emissions should be updated at the time tracking begins. Is this basically going to in your filing where you state we're going to use every year we're going to use the most recent version of the monthly PJM emissions rates? Is that what that was trying to get to, or was there something else?
Well, really, that's a dollar valuation question, right? So we have guidance from Empower on some of the dollar values, but I think as we look forward and start reporting out that we're going to want to kind of review those dollar values annually each year, right, before we actually apply them, make sure that we're using whatever the latest values are there. And there may be a need for a discussion with the working group, or perhaps that's something that's obvious that we can just pull off the shelf, right?
Right. I think, okay. And so this is basically a statement really for everything we've discussed today on this tab, which is at the beginning of the year, update for the latest and greatest.
I think that's right. I think that's the way we ought to look at this going forward. We don't want to make it too cumbersome, but we also want to use the latest information for that report.
Okay. I don't think we would have an issue. I like using latest and greatest, so I don't think that's an issue. All right, that's everything I have, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything they think we should discuss?
Yeah, the only other thing that I wanted to bring up is there is a tab here that has the data collection tab on the tail.
Sure.
And is the thought there that that several of these items would be included in the metrics report, or how are you thinking of that?
I think there was a thought that we might be able to come up with one spreadsheet which had all of these reporting items, and as you note, many of them refer back to what we already, the metrics we already came up with, right? So we could either refer to what we already filed or refer to the narrative if it's going to be updated. But I'm thinking we could try to come up with one spreadsheet which had all of these items that have to be reported. I don't think there are too many that
There's some additional ones, but they're kind of just accounting item, right? For example, the number of days necessary to achieve project permitting, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't know that we were as interested in those if they weren't really metrics.
Yeah, well, just a question for you on that tab. Are we thinking that that's part of the metric report, or that's something else that we would collect for another purpose?
Well, I guess I'll throw it back to Mr. Cleaver, who from the beginning said that his interpretation of the commission's order was that not only did we have to update the metrics that we did before, but we also had to sort of report on the items that needed to be reported on. Do I have that right, Mr. Cleaver?
It generally sounds right. I mean, I think that what beyond the comments on the metrics themselves, I think that our primary position, which we tried to convey in the January 15th comments, is that as much as possible, we would just like to see as much uniformity as possible so that we're able to compare one project to another and be able to kind of have an apples to apples comparison. I do think that would fall within, that kind of discussion would fall within what the commission included within the scope of its order, reading that paragraph from the order that came out in November about what the working group was being reconvened for. Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I do. I don't think I have anything to add, Joe. Thank you.
So these other items on this tab, are we just Judge Lawrence, are we thinking that we would report those out too? I mean, it has the number of days required to achieve permitting and that kind of thing.
Steve, these are the PUA requirements. So you have to report them once a year. Most of these you have to report once a year starting in 2023. And I think some at the end are part of the 2024 and 2026 reports. So I agree with Mr. Cleaver that if we don't do, I think when staff was thinking about this, we thought that we would, within this work group, this is an appropriate venue to basically figure out what's going to get provided, like make sure we're all in alignment on what's in those 48 plus items, because we're going to be receiving them every year. So I think we do think that this is something we should cover. But you will, I should say the PUA requires you to report all these items. And so to the extent we aren't clear on what that is, we should probably get clarity on that.
Okay.
I think for the ones that are, go ahead.
No, I mean, our thinking is that it makes no sense for the commission or anyone else who'd look at this to have one report on this staff work, the work group measures, and then another report on the statutory criteria that aren't, don't have the same thing in the same places. So our thinking is, we might as well, to the extent we can, bring them together so that you have a guide to file one single report and identify if anything is not clear in there. I've already gone through it once, and then Nitsan took it again and identified the ones that are clearly self-implementing, like address, right? You don't need any guidance on how to fill that out, but some of the other ones we might.
Well, you never know, right? So yeah.
What do you mean by address?
Yeah, right, exactly. No, but there are a couple in here. I think there's one in here that probably needs some additional definition. That's
I guess what we would look to you to do then, as part of your quick turnaround items, is to identify which items in the third tab you think require further discussion, because they don't either, they aren't, just common sense or based on your project, or don't track back to everything we've just been discussing. If there's a few items left, and there might be, if you could highlight which ones you think require further discussion, and we can let everyone know, and then we can have that further discussion.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Sounds good.
Speaking of which, What do you think your turnaround time is on your action items?
Yeah, it's hey Justin, are you still there? I mean, so
Yeah, he's still there.
yeah, we
I'm
should
still here.
think across our three companies. What do you think? I don't know. What would be a reasonable time frame? Because our report is due out towards the end of March, right? What
So
would be a help? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, let's just go through what, I have notes of the things I was sort of directly involved in, so you have to fill in the gaps. But we're getting back on the threshold of $500,000 for distribution grid investments, as well as some kind of qualitative metric or information that helps track back to that avoidance and deferral. We were going to come back on with a 50-50, 90-10 forecast would be something we'd be comfortable with. We were also going to come back with our 8760 information versus the aggregated at in hourly blocks, whether we'd be comfortable with that. I think in terms of revenue, we are going to confirm whether we would be able to provide monthly, not just annual PJM revenue, and then also by market. And I think there's also a commitment to meet up on SARFI between BGE and between the joint utilities and potentially as well, Potomac Edison and staff.
And some of the other alternative measurement characteristics, right?
Yeah,
and
that's fair.
so staff was going to set up a meeting on that, right?
Yeah, I'll get an email out to get that organized.
Okay, great.
So,
and that'll drive that timing too, right? So
yeah.
Well, I don't want to be held up by that though, because I think we said that there's a little more flexibility with that item. So let's not hold up the other items.
Okay.
For that
I mean,
one.
I feel like so outside of the SARFI, whatever the power quality discussion, I think we can make a quick turn. But which item is I missing that we need to get back to the?
Steve was also going to figure out the whole resiliency and get back to me with exactly how we're going to value that, right, Steve?
Right, and the definition, just clarify the definition.
Get that all cleared up.
Yeah, and then the other one that we had was reaching out to Montgomery County government related to the data that we can get related to the actual operation of the bus depot.
So what do we think, like March 8th, 9th?
What's that, 2 weeks?
Yeah, or thereabouts.
Go ahead.
I'm comfortable with that.
Okay. Yeah, I am as well. So I think that's reasonable.
I don't know
outside of the power quality discussion, I think that's.
Yeah, the power. Yeah, of all of them, the power quality one is probably the most challenging, right? Well, resiliency, right? We're never going to agree on the final one on that, but the power.
We don't have to. Yeah, keep in mind, Steve, we don't have to agree. We need to propose something, and then we can everybody can reserve their rights, but we need to come up with something. Okay, and then I don't know if we'll meet again or we'll exchange emails because both the commission calendar and my calendar get a little busier in March, but if we need to, we can. But we'll see what the utilities provide on by the 9th, and then we'll take it from there. Does that sound good?
Yeah, so you're suggesting that we get back to you by the 9th?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, if you would just want to send it to the whole group, that's fine. If you prefer to send it to me and then I send it to everyone, that's also fine. I generally don't look at it, so you might as well just send it to everyone.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, I don't look at it before I send it. I look at it eventually, but I don't look at it before I send it.
Got it. Right.
Good save. Yeah. Good save there.
Right. Yeah. So, all right, that sounds good. Yeah, we can commit to that, and then ideally, if we have that discussion with the engineering side sometime between now and then, right? Maybe next.
Yeah. Week. No. Let's shoot for next week. I'll get an email out to the lawyers and we can get that coordinated.
Okay. Great.
Okay. Thanks. All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jones.
Have a good day.
You too.